Please be seated.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 30, Health Statutes Amendment Act 2020. Honourable Mr. Shandro.
The Honourable Minister of Health, and I believe for the direction of all members, I believe we are on Amendment A1 but we are not on Amendment A1. So the Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to rise and move second reading of Bill 30, the Health Statutes Amendment Act of 2020. Mr. Speaker, Bill 30 makes essential amendments to health legislation and to improve our public health care system. These proposed changes support three main objectives. The first is strengthening the role of Albertans in our health system. The second, meeting our commitment to reducing surgical wait times. And third, modernizing the health system here in Alberta so that it's more effective. These changes are long overdue. The previous government never made these types of changes a priority during their 4 years in government. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to building a more responsive health system which puts patients and their families at the center of everything that we do, engaging Albertans to ensure our health system meets their needs, reducing surgical wait times, and increasing access to physicians and other health professionals. Now, Bill 30 supports our efforts in ensuring that Albertans have access to safe, high-quality health services in a more sustainable and efficient manner. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me go through the highlights of the Act. The first, the proposed amendments will better support and strengthen the work of the Health Quality Council of Alberta. Proposed amendments would expand the Council's mandate to include patient-centered care. Care happens, of course, not just in hospitals or physicians' offices, but also in the community, at places such as pharmacies, mental health and addiction clinics, doctors' offices, or in continuing care centres. We're providing the HQCA an additional $1 million this year on top of their annual budget to support this new focus and to envision new, broader, bolder engagement strategies with patients, their families, and all Albertans to find system gaps and promote a better healthcare system. Now, the Health Quality Council of Alberta will remain a vital arm's-length organization and will conduct independent public inquiries when they're called to do so. By clarifying the council, that the council reports to and shares their work with the Minister of Health, as do their counterparts in other provinces, we can better coordinate all the work happening in the province to promote patient safety, strengthen service quality, and listen to the health needs of Albertans. Next, the amendments to the Health Professions Act would increase the number of public members appointed to regulatory college councils, as well as their complaint review committees and their hearing tribunals. This means that the number of public members will increase to 50%, up from 25%. At, for example, the College and Association of Registered Nurses of Alberta, as one example, or the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta. Now, we want to ensure that the public and patients' needs are heard and reflected in all aspects of governance, complaint reviews, and discipline hearings. Regulatory colleges will maintain their self-governance role and will continue to elect and appoint members of their professions to these committees, but the proposed changes will make sure that the voices of Albertans complement the voices of the experts during major council or college decisions. Next, the amendments are needed to the Healthcare Protection Act to reflect our modern health system under one consolidated health authority, Alberta Health Services. Many Albertans need faster and better access to surgeries to, for example, replace their knees, their hips, remove cataracts, among other surgeries. Surgical wait times are far too long and have been made even longer as we made space early in the pandemic to treat patients with COVID-19. The good news is pandemic cases are stable in Alberta, and AHS has begun as far back as May 4th, rescheduling and performing scheduled surgeries again in this province. I think we are now at 70% of our pre-COVID capacity. We hope by September to be at 100% of our capacity, our pre-COVID capacity, getting by January to 125% of our pre-COVID capacity, and eventually in 2021 getting to 150% of our pre-COVID capacity and remaining there until the end of this term of this legislature. Amendments to the Healthcare Protection Act will make it easier for chartered surgical facilities to work with us and HS to provide publicly funded surgeries to people who need them. Currently, we have in this province 43 of these chartered surgical facilities that work under contract with AHS to provide surgeries to Albertans outside our hospitals at no expense to patients. And let me repeat that for the members opposite. The surgeries in these facilities are paid for publicly at no expense to patients. The proposed amendments here in Bill 30 would reduce barriers and administrative burden so that new chartered surgical facilities can more easily open, reducing surgical wait times for cataracts, among other surgeries. Now, of course, strong oversight of these facilities would be maintained, and the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta would continue to accredit these facilities to ensure that they provide safe, quality procedures. The current process for chartered surgical facilities to open and contract with AHS can take as much as 2 years. We can't afford to wait any longer to reduce our wait times and provide tens of thousands of more surgeries to waiting Albertans. Wait times increased every year under the previous government, and they did, unfortunately, nothing about it. Now they're claiming that the changes create American-style health care, and that's pure hypocrisy of the NDP. Nothing about these changes are American style. They are pure and simple Albertan style. The fact is that under the NDP, the independent providers throughout our province delivered publicly funded surgery, lab tests, continuing care, home care, housekeeping, laundry, and other services throughout this province, just like they do now, and just like other provinces under governments of all parties. The NDP funded the same clinics here to do the same surgeries for 4 years. The difference between the NDP and our government is that we're committed to working with all of our partners to make the system better for our patients, first and foremost by reducing wait times. We remain committed to providing every Albertan his or her surgery within clinically appropriate wait times by 2023. That is, Mr. Speaker, 78% of our surgeries within 4 months, the remainder within 26 weeks. This is an ambitious goal. No other jurisdiction in Canada can meet this goal so far, and especially with steps taken to ensure that Alberta's health system could sustain its pandemic response while also responding to our emergencies. Now, Bill 30 will help us meet our wait time goals by increasing access to publicly funded surgeries in Alberta. We're also proposing amendments to the Alberta Healthcare Insurance Act to give physicians more options on how they're compensated. Right now, only 13% of our physicians in Alberta choose alternative ways of being paid, such as through annualized salary-like payment models, for example, rather than fee-for-services. This is far lower than the 29% of physicians across Canada who are paid through alternate compensation arrangements. Alberta physicians and the Alberta Medical Association have told government that one reason for these low participation rates here in Alberta is because current alternative programming is only available through a very cumbersome ministerial order process. Physicians and the AMA have been clear for years that service contracts would be preferred. So we're proposing amendments to facilitate contractual payment options that will support innovation in delivery of care. Alternative compensation options allow physicians to spend more time with their patients, especially patients with complex needs, without having to worry about service volumes. And we're committed to creating compensation options that help us attract and retain talented physicians to provide high-quality care throughout Alberta, including in our rural and remote communities. Further proposed amendments to the Healthcare Insurance Act would allow us not only to compensate physicians, as the current Act prescribes, but also to contract directly with a range of organizations to deliver medical services and run local medical clinics, for example, Indigenous communities and municipalities. This opens up a number of possibilities for the provision of healthcare that puts patients and Albertans at the center of the system. We're also strengthening accountability so that Albertans have access to an integrated health system with effective planning, coordination, and delivery of services. Modernizing the Regional Health Authorities Act will clarify that Alberta Health Services is the single health authority here in Alberta. Through our proposed amendments, we are clarifying their accountability for providing top quality services to Albertans across the province. The amendments also clearly recognize the vital and unique role that Covenant plays alongside AHS as a strategic partner and as the largest provider of faith-based healthcare services here in Alberta. Covenant Health's leadership in the delivery of compassionate, quality healthcare in the province is unparalleled and extends back more than 150 years. Covenant Health is, in fact, older than our province, Mr. Speaker. And I want to be clear that the proposed amendments will not result in changes to Covenant Health as an organization or to their service delivery. Covenant Health will continue to control its own operations. The proposed amendments to the Regional Health Authority Act will not affect the day-to-day operations of Covenant Health or to Alberta Health Services, but these amendments will clarify their roles and the role of the ministry as recommended in the AHS review. And now this will strengthen accountability and coordination and help government guide the system as a whole to meet strategic goals and ensure accountability for the public dollars that are invested in healthcare here in Alberta. And next, proposed changes to the Hospitals Amendment Act will ease the requirements of membership for the Hospital Privileges Appeal Board so that more people are eligible for appointment. Previously, only members of a very specific healthcare boards were eligible for appointment to the board, which reviews grievance brought forward by medical staff against hospital boards. We're proposing to expand appointment options, to change quorum requirements, and to ease the scheduling of meetings and reduce review delays. We're also introducing amendments to clarify COVID-19 quarantine requirements for international travelers coming to Alberta. Right now, the Act requires people returning to Alberta from international destinations to quarantine for 14 days. The amendments will clarify that anyone entering Alberta will have, after having traveled internationally, must adhere to the 14-day quarantine requirement to align with the orders of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. And last, Bill 30, if passed, will repeal the Provincial Health Authorities of Alberta Act, which is no longer necessary, since Alberta only has one rather than multiple health authorities, which were disbanded in 2009. It would also repeal the Health Governance Transition Act, as this is also a piece of vestigial legislation which is no longer required here in Alberta. It served its purpose to help AHS take over the responsibilities for cancer treatment, mental health and addiction services when the Alberta Mental Health Board and the Alberta Cancer Board, as well as ADAC, the Alberta Alcohol and Drug Abuse Commission, were dissolved and the amalgamation and merging to create AHS in 2009. We're also proposing amendments to other legislation to ensure that the Alberta Cancer Foundation continues its important role as a fundraiser for cancer care, prevention, and research across this province. And in closing, Mr. Speaker, altogether, our proposed amendments will modernize health legislation and set us on a strong path to making our public health system more accessible, more sustainable, with patients, their families, and communities and caregivers at the center of all of our work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, sorry. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill 30, the Health Statutes Amendment Act. Thank you.
Thank you, honourable members. The Honourable Minister of Health has moved second reading of Bill 30, Health Statutes Amendment Act 2020. Does the Assembly agree with? Well, so he has not adjourned. Yes, of course. So, are there any honourable members in the House who would like to join debate on second reading? We were getting ahead of ourselves there. I'm looking, but I'm not quite sure I recognize who the honourable member is. I believe it's the Minister of Transportation.
At this point, Mr. Speaker, I move to adjourn debate on Bill 30.
Having heard the motion from the Honourable Minister of Transportation to adjourn debate, does the Assembly agree? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 29, Local Authorities Election Amendment Act 2020, the Honourable Mr. Madhu.
I see the Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to rise and move second reading of Bill 29, the Local Authorities Election Amendment Act 2020. In order to promote healthy and democratic local elections, We are proposing changes to the current Act that will increase the fairness and accessibility of local elections, clarify the roles of advertisers, cut unnecessary red tape, and make it easier for new candidates to run meaningful campaigns. The changes include expanding the ability of donors to support candidates across the province by allowing them to donate up to $5,000 per candidate, increasing the amount candidates can spend outside of the campaign period to $5,000 and up to $10,000 a year for self-funded candidates, updating advertising rules to enable third parties to participate in our democratic discourse, cutting red tape by requiring surplus funds over $1,000 to be donated to charity and not held in trust accounts by municipalities to be carried over to the next election cycle, making sure that candidates can focus their effort on running meaningful campaigns by moving the disclosure due date to after elections are over, in line with other jurisdictions in Canada, and keeping the option open for recall legislation to be developed in the future, as many Albertans have indicated they would like to see. Mr. Speaker, it has become clear just how great the incumbent advantage is in our local elections. In the past 3 Edmonton municipal elections, going back 10 years, Mr. Speaker, there has only been one newcomer that has been successful against an incumbent. For the past 3 Calgary municipal elections, the number is only slightly better, with just 3 candidates running successful campaigns against incumbents. Another barrier, Mr. Speaker, to entry that has yet to be addressed is gender. Out of the 4 successful candidates just mentioned, none were female. In fact, only 2 of Alberta's 19 major cities have female mayors. Both of these women were elected after the previous mayors retired, meaning there was no incumbent. This bill, Mr. Speaker, promotes equality in local elections by adding systemic support for new candidates. By donating excess funds to charity, each candidate will begin collecting donations at the same starting line. By adding more flexibility to donation regulations, candidates without name recognition will still have a number of opportunities to make their voices heard. If passed, Mr. Speaker, this bill will ensure a level playing field between new and experienced candidates, clarify the involvement of third parties in local elections, and cut red tape to make local elections more streamlined for candidates, voters, school boards, municipal government, and indeed all Albertans. With that, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill 29.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. Are there any honourable members looking to join debate? I see the honourable member for Edmonton McClung has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good evening, all members. I have just heard, along with the members of the House, the Minister reflect upon what he thought were the goals of the legislation that he's just moved second reading of, the Local Authorities Amendment Act 2020. And he mentioned in his speech that some of the goals that he thought he would be achieving with this legislation would be more democratic local elections, greater fairness in the election process, clarifying the rules of the election process, decreasing red tape, make it easier for new candidates to run, and level the playing field in local elections. Well, Mr. Speaker, these would be laudable goals, and this legislation might be worthy of the name had any of these goals actually been achieved within the legislation. For in fact, what this legislation does, like much of the legislation that the UCP has proposed in this 30th legislature, is the opposite of what they suggest it might do. In fact, I'll argue that it does make democratic elections less democratic. It makes them less fair. It muddies the rules, increases red tape, makes it more difficult for new candidates to enter the field, and tilts the playing field against individuals who are less able to afford the high cost of these new UCP local election rules. So, Mr. Speaker, we all know right now outside it's raining again in the Edmonton area, and it's pretty wet. We've significantly been impacted by rain and wetness, whether it's been here in Edmonton, whether it's been up in Fort McMurray recently. Not long ago in Calgary, there's been flooding. I've recently spent on Thursday afternoon, or Friday afternoon, I should say, time in Thorhill County, where I witnessed the inundated fields and flooded fields of our farmers in that county, which has now been declared an agricultural disaster area. And Mr. Speaker, what this piece of legislation reminds me of is that a flood. Now, it's not a flood of water that we're seeing, Mr. Speaker, it's a flood of cash. I'm thinking right now of one of the earlier game shows that used to be on television that most prairie viewers will remember, and I think the Premier is of a certain age where he would remember it as well. And it was Royal Light Windfall. It was a game show where contestants who had been given little pull cards from the gas station when they bought gasoline would send them into a draw, and the draw would be a great big global sphere, which was a see-through plastic globe, and the wind would flurry up all the different contestants' entry forms, and then they would reach in during it was a televised thing. They would reach in, and the moderator would pull out a winner, and live on television, the winner of the Royal Light Windfall would be announced, and it was a big thing. People watched it with bated breath. But tell you what, that's the image I get of this when I think about this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, is that of a windfall. And the windfall of cash is going to those individuals, Mr. Speaker, who are the beneficiaries of the very many channels of cash that this legislation opens up to candidates who are privy to the inner workings of money movement in the electoral process in Alberta. Now, we had hoped to have gotten rid of much of this type of political activity where we see money freely flowing and dictating who may actually win, from a nomination campaign all the way up to a leadership campaign to a general election. And when we were in government, of course, we did our very best to abate this flow of cash so that it was a level playing field, so that we took big money out of politics. But what we're seeing with this legislation, Mr. Speaker, is a blatant reversal of that whole attitude. We're seeing the floodgates open up in many different ways so that cash can freely flow, and those individuals who are the beneficiaries of it will be the ones who are more likely to be elected. Now, I'll state clearly, Mr. Speaker, that the vast majority of Albertans cannot afford to donate $5,000 to any single candidate. Right now, only the wealthiest people can donate $5,000 per person to as many candidates as they want. And that's one of the things that this piece of legislation allows. It allows an individual to donate $5,000 per person to as many candidates as they would like. So it brings in gobs and gobs and gobs of cash to the electoral process in Alberta in our municipal elections. And it really is a method that this government is using to influence who actually gets elected in this province by tilting the playing field in favor of those that the people with money in this province who can afford to donate $5,000 a person to as many people on the slate of candidates that they may choose to select would be the beneficiary of it. It makes sure that the wealthy friends of the UCP can finance as many campaigns as they want. And it's really reprehensible, Mr. Speaker, and it's the height of hypocrisy for the member who is the Minister for Municipal Affairs to stand in this legislation and suggest that this flood of cash, this Royal Light windfall, this winning ticket will produce democratic local elections, will increase fairness in our election process, will it clarifies the rules, will it reduce red tape, or make it easier for newcomers to run. It totally tilts the playing field in favor of those with the biggest and deepest pockets, Mr. Speaker, and it's a height of hypocrisy, and it's the worst of what we used to see in Alberta politics happening all over again. I don't think that anybody watching tonight would see anything more clearly than that. There's no facade, there's no screen over the theater, there's no curtain rising that will attempt to blow a smoke screen. The UCP are unashamedly, unabashedly opening the wells for cash to spring forward to support candidates that would benefit from those Albertans who can afford to play. Now, these municipal elections are basically, Mr. Speaker, being put up for sale by the Premier and his caucus. And I'm sure he's confident that his wealthy friends will be there willing to buy those elections. And I'm pretty sure we're going to see American-style PACs in our local campaigns. And that's exactly what this legislation is aimed to do. I mean, it's, well, shameful and unbelievable that the minister will get up and claim that it's going to have the opposite effect when he knows full well that the whole design of this plan is to tilt this playing field in favor of the supporters of the individuals who will want a certain slate of candidates supported by wealthy individuals elected in municipal elections. And by doing so, Mr. Speaker, there's a level of control in the municipalities that the government currently doesn't have right now, short of course, emasculating the powers of the municipalities, which is something they're also working on. But the level of control by way of tilting the playing field to ensure that their slate of candidates gets elected, theirs that would be more inclined to support the policies that the provincial government would like to see, a little bit less opposed perhaps to some of the ways that the current government is operating. I know that the relationship currently between the two largest municipalities and our Alberta government is more than somewhat strained, and I think this legislation reflects that this government would like to see that change, not by collaborating, Mr. Speaker, or engaging with the rightfully elected municipal administrations in Edmonton and Calgary, but by replacing them with people, let's say, of a more favorable bent. And that's the type of legislation we've come to see as the norm in this 30th legislature with the UCP at the helm. And I'm not surprised, certainly disappointed, and I think that Albertans who are watching this will be wondering how in the world we are stepping back in time once again on this plate, on municipal elections, because it seems to be every subject matter, every field that we touch, whether it's municipal elections, whether it's financing of provincial elections, whether it's nomination meetings, whether it's leadership campaigns, whether it's any part of the electoral process where there are donations that can be made. This government is intent on reversing the progress that was made towards leveling the playing field that we incorporated into our legislation and going back to the good old days when you could open up your wallet and let the cash flow and give money to others and let them donate. The rules were pretty fast and loose, Mr. Speaker, and I don't think that Albertans expected in one fell swoop to see in the first term of a UCP government that this would be something that they would entertain. And as far as the first term goes, I think Albertans who I talk to are very much inclined to do their very level best to make sure it's the last term that this government serves as the government in this province. And this government knows indeed that they are in a bit of trouble, to say the least, in many quarters of this province politically because of some of their policies that run against the grain the wishes of Albertans when it comes to public service and investment in public service. And one of the ways that the current government hopes to gain favor with the electorate is to tilt the balance, to, in municipal elections, try to install individuals who would be spouting more of their dogma at a municipal level than currently we find the case. I know that when we were in government, one of the things that we did on purpose, and I think it was welcomed by municipalities, was to involve, as a former Minister of Economic Development and Trade indicated today in our Public Accounts Committee meetings, to involve the concept of collaboration at every step of the way with our municipal partners. When we looked at implementing services and spending tax dollars that could be more effectively spent on a regional basis. And that's the type of collaboration, that's the type of direction that our government took, and the approach that municipalities truly respected. And we're seeing the opposite thing happening, Mr. Speaker, with this government in terms of its relationship with municipalities and the disdain with which it holds current administrations is striking. I really don't understand why this government fails to see how a positive partnership with municipalities is something that should be properly negotiated and reached at respectful discussions, and rather than something that is force-fed. But that's exactly what we're seeing with this legislation, Mr. Speaker. This legislation, this bill, will flood municipal and school board campaigns with dark money, following the two other bills introduced this week that will allow pretty much unlimited fundraising for provincial referendum campaigns on topics to be decided by the Premier. The bill, as I alluded to, is clear evidence that this government is going to attack the rules that try to keep big money out of politics, because they're clearly incapable of following them. They had to fire the guy that was investigating them, and the next step is to change the law, Mr. Speaker, because they can't function without having friends and insiders hand them big wads of cash, a true Royalite windfall. At least now, Mr. Speaker, the corporate giveaways seem to make a little bit of sense, making sure shareholders have more money to donate and more places to put that money to secure power for the current government. Now, the government undertook a survey when it announced that it would be analyzing the Local Elections Authorities Act. It invited Albertans to participate and express their views on a range of topics that the bill now changes. However, the results of the survey were never released. Why has the government not made the survey results public? Albertans are wondering, Mr. Speaker. For something as important as changes to local elections, local democracy, we really need to know what the public has said. Did the government consult with local municipalities? Were they asked if indeed they wanted big money once again to influence local elections? Were they asked, Mr. Speaker, if indeed they wanted to see local elections directed by a few with deep pockets and an intent to influence the democratic process? Did the government consult with civil society groups that encourage Albertans from underrepresented or marginalized groups to run for public office? Not likely. Did they say that changes put forward in this bill would help Albertans from underrepresented groups run for office? Why then? When? When did they learn? What were the consultations? We haven't seen or heard the results. Nothing has been released. Is that consultation, if there was adequate consultation, reflected in the bill? How does it increase the cap for newcomers? In fact, if that is a goal of the Municipal Affairs Minister. Is it your experience that first-time candidates have access to more or less funds, Mr. Speaker. I know that there's a lot of questions that Albertans have on their minds about this piece of legislation, and they have a lot of concerns about where it's going as far as influencing our elections. We'd like to think in this province, in this country, that we live in a free and open democracy that allows people to express themselves and run for office if they like, and to pick the best candidate if they are electors, to freely be able to decide, and after a full hearing of the various candidates for election. Yet what we're seeing with this legislation, Mr. Speaker, is a process which will deny that free and open hearing, a process that will stop the newcomers from being able to enter because of the barrier of large cash, unless perhaps they're the favored son or daughter of those with the big, large sums of cash to donate. So I'm not very hopeful, Mr. Speaker, that we'll see any improvement in democracy. In fact, I think it's going to do the opposite if this legislation passes. The attempt to bring big money into local elections is staggering with this piece of legislation. It removes a $4,000 limit on annual contributions to local campaigns that we had introduced, and increases it to $10,000 per candidate before and after polling day. It allows individuals to donate up to $5,000 each to an unlimited number of municipal and school board candidates before polling day. Mr. Speaker, Albertans watching at home or reading this legislation can add. And they know how quickly those $5,000 donations will add up. And believe me, Mr. Speaker, they know who in this province has got that kind of money. And for the most part, it's not them. It's people who have deep pockets, who wish to influence legislation in a certain way, who will be able to come up with that kind of cash to donate to multiple candidates and be subsidized for it with tax receipts as well, Mr. Speaker. Maybe that's something that should be added to this legislation. Maybe we should see an amendment so that the individuals who make over a certain amount of donation should not have any tax benefit. That'd be a question to ask, if those individuals would be as willing to donate if there was no tax benefit. Maybe they would be. Let's not give the UCP any ideas. They just might be willing to jump on that one. But, Mr. Speaker, to be honest about it, there's a very small percentage of Albertans who could even fathom coming up with $5,000 for one candidate, never mind multiple candidates. And it's a small percentage, Mr. Speaker, who will have that economic power that will translate into political power given the passage of this legislation. It's the type of thing we see south of the border, where you'll find that individuals with huge bank accounts will finance hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any members looking to join debate? I see the Honourable Member for no 29-2A on this. There will be 29-2As on further debaters. Are you still looking? Okay, then the Honourable Member for Calgary-Buffalo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Like my friend from Edmonton, McClung, and his eloquence in talking about how utterly disappointed he is in this bill, Local Authorities Amendment Act, I share those feelings because I think it fails on many levels and misses the opportunity to actually make something meaningful happen in this province for local elections. And I want to start by just talking about some of the reactions people have had since the, I believe, June 25th introduction of this bill in this House. The reactions that are reported in the media, Mr. Chair, are not good, to say the least. For instance, one person's commented, and he's an expert on municipal elections, on local elections, and he says, This is the title of the report. It says, Alberta, or the media report, Alberta local elections bill gets mixed reaction from experts and former candidates. And one expert is quoted as saying, "This is the first example I've come across of a government basically weakening provisions rather than strengthening them." And that's Bill 29 in a nutshell. But as my friend from Edmonton, McClung, has said, that's this government's work in the 30th legislature in a nutshell as well. To recap, this expert says, "This is the first example I've come across of a government basically weakening provisions rather than strengthening them." What were some of those strengthened provisions that have been weakened, Mr. Chair? Well, one of them is, as my friend from Edmonton, McClung, has used the analogy of flooding, or the example of flooding. A really big one is the flood of money that will come into local elections. And you may say that I'm thinking the worst. I'm going to an extreme that will never happen in this province. But if you read the legislation, and we've all read Bill 29's legislation, the Amendment Act to the Local Elections Authorities Election Act, it is frankly disturbing to see the kind of time and attention that has been put to third-party advertisers, and the amount, the amount of cash that they can bring into elections, not only in one jurisdiction, but they can, once they get to 10 jurisdictions, they can be then provincially regulated. So already there's been some thought that there will be third-party advertisers who will enlist or register across this province in numerous jurisdictions, and that frankly is disturbing. The other reactions from in the media, I'll just read a few of them. Past and present leaders blast proposed local election finance changes. That's in the St. Albert Today. They blast them for good reasons. Another one is municipal election funding legislation contains, quote, one enormous mistake, end quote, Nenshi says. And I think and that was CBC Calgary, if I recall back when I heard that report on the radio, it said the fact that people donating funds to a candidate don't have to be disclosed by that candidate until after the election. And the minister has said that will make it easier for people to focus on knocking on doors, getting their brochures together, going to forums. That's, of course, he's suggesting providing documentation of who is giving you donations before the election is too onerous for candidates, and they would be spending too much of their time away from the campaign trail, away from addressing local issues. They would be spending too much time that the Minister of Municipal Affairs has put in this amendment that donors don't have to be disclosed till after the election. That is the one enormous mistake Mayor Nenshi says this bill undertakes. He does give, and it's not here, but I'll give one sliver of positive kudos to the minister, and that is that candidates can't hold more than $1,000, and if they're elected, they must donate the surplus to a charity. I think that's a great idea. In fact, I know that many candidates did that in the last election. Another bit of criticism, not a bit, a lot of criticism to this bill is from Ask Her YYC. That's a group committed to try and get parity on councils throughout the province, all sorts of councils, whether they be school boards or local councils. And Parity YEG want changes to Bill 29. And they believe that the kinds of things that are in this bill will make it harder for women to get elected across this province. Another criticism is from Everything Grand Prairie, and the Grand Prairie mayor is unhappy with proposed changes to local elections introduced in Bill 29. That is pretty evident when you read the full accounting of that report. And the last one, again, I mentioned off the top, Alberta local elections bill gets mixed reaction from experts and former candidates. That was CBC Edmonton. Rather than strengthening this government is basically weakening provisions. That's the experts' account of all of that. I took the opportunity to look up RMA's views on this Bill 29, and they go at it a little bit differently in terms of what they would like to see in the bill. And they talk about principles 1 through 4, that they want to see addressed. And I can tell you that on at least 2 of these, I see significant failure in this bill to address these principles. And I'll start with the 4th one. It talks about nonpartisan and municipally focused. That's what the principle is, nonpartisan and municipally focused. So this is what they say with regard to that. The campaigning and election process should be designed in such a way as to ensure that candidates are focused on and accountable to the interests of their municipality as opposed to a political party or broader ideology. And the reason I think that this bill fails terribly with regard to that principle is that one of the things my colleague from Edmonton McClung says is donors now are not capped in terms of how much money they want to, how many candidates they want to give up to $5,000 to. They can give money to one candidate in all of the municipalities and school board elections in the province. We know that Bills 26 and 27 with regard to referenda and senatorial elections will certainly not meet this test for principle number 4. And that's with regard to being municipally focused. They would like to see nonpartisan and municipal focused elections. So a focus on the municipalities' issues, not on senatorial elections or on referenda the province, the government believes are important. And certainly they would argue that the amount of money that third-party advertisers are likely going to be coming into municipal elections, probably in the major cities across this province, the 7 big ones, and probably many more, will take the focus away from the municipal elections and be on province-wide issues. The first principle is inclusive and accessible, and it talks about all those meeting eligibility requirements should have reasonable means to participate as candidates in and vote in an election. I don't see where this bill helps any of that in terms of inclusivity and accessibility. Fair and equitable. All candidates should have comparable opportunities to participate. And just on that point, and the minister talked about, one of the reasons is the incumbent advantage, and talked about Edmonton and Calgary. The local people in those wards voted for candidates in their ward. And for some reason, the minister seems to believe that the local folks don't know what's in their best interests, don't know who they want to represent them. And if one newcomer has come in 10 years, and 3 in Calgary, I think he said, in 10 years, who's to say that those newcomers weren't better than the incumbent? They were, because they won at that point. But who's to say the incumbents who won in all the other cases weren't better than the newcomers? I think the minister is saying he thinks that he knows better than the electors in those ridings, in those wards. The The amount of money is just staggering that potentially could come into elections. I think it's a problem for $5,000 donations to hit the accounts of candidates before the election and possibly after the election if there's a deficit from that same donor. And then when you multiply that across this province, it starts to get a little staggering in terms of where local finances for elections are going. I'll certainly be able to get more into this bill with other stakeholders. That's my interest, to bring forward at the Committee of the Whole amendments that will make this bill better, and to, as the person who's an expert says, to put more strength back into this bill. We had a bill before with the Local Authorities Election Act that capped the amount of donations at $4,000 per individual. And that, I think, was really what broadening democracy is all about. So the money comes and gets reported before the election from all sorts of people. And, in many cases, they're not staggering amounts of money. They're $100 here, $200 there, $50 there. And the person who can show that they've got the broadest appeal, previously, the person who showed they got the broadest appeal usually was the person who won. They got a lot of small donations. They worked hard to talk about the local issues in their community. They worked hard to make sure that they were representative of the people they wanted to be sitting around a council table for. That's how elections were won under the previous rules. And under these new changes to the amendments that are here, it is kind of shocking to think what our future councils might look like. The third principle, I didn't talk about it, was from RMA and how they've gone about reviewing this bill, is to talk about whether it meets the principles. So the third one is transparent and accountable. All candidates should be required to disclose contributions received to ensure adherence to applicable campaign finance requirements. Now, it doesn't say before the election, but it doesn't take a genius to see that transparent and accountable is what they're looking for. And Bill 29 is not transparent. It's transparent after the fact. So how does that help a person understand who you're getting money from before the election occurs? It doesn't. It weakens that provision. And I think what smart candidates will do is that they'll start declaring who they're getting funds from day one of the campaign trail. And they'll say, I'm getting funds from X, Y, and Z, and they'll total them up. And they'll have an advantage over a person who says, look, the bill says we don't have to disclose until after the election. Well, I'm not going to vote for that person. That person's got something probably to hide. The most transparent candidates.
Thank you, honorable members. I see the honorable 29-2A is available and I believe that the Minister of Transportation has risen on that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise on 29-2A. I listened with great entertainment to the speech we just heard. Lots of stuff to work with there, so I'll try to pick out some of my favorites. I particularly like the references to third-party advertising. Mr. Speaker, there was never, ever nearly as much activity on third-party advertising as there was in the last provincial election. And wait for it, Mr. Speaker, under whose legislation? Whose legislation? Well, I think it was the NDP's legislation, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, and yet they're the ones that created the biggest opportunity for third-party advertising in the history of Alberta. 5 million from unions. 5 million from, including 5 million from unions, and now they have the actual, I'm trying to think of a polite word, courage, let's say courage, that's a nice word, like chutzpah, that's a nice Jewish good word for courage, to stand up and complain about it after they created what they're just stood up for 15 minutes and complained about. This is just unbelievable. I will give the honourable member that just spoke credit for one thing, because now municipal councillors can't do what I did. And what that honourable member did when we were in the city council together is that you actually had the ability to keep money between elections to store it up for the next election, giving the incumbents a big advantage. And I give the honourable member credit for pointing that that's a good piece of the legislation. I thank him for that. But in fairness, we didn't hear that when I was on city council. We didn't hear that when the honourable member was on city council. So I would say that's probably a good thing. And it might even have something to do with the fact that so few incumbents are defeated in elections. Heck, you give somebody a $40,000 head start or an $80,000 head start, beat me now. It's like a foot race for the 100 meters. I stand at the 90 and you stand at the 0, and let's see who gets to the 100 first. I'm guessing the person that starts at the 90 will get to the 100 most of the time first. And that's kind of how the deck has been able to be stacked in the past. So it's I would dare say that the provisions, weakening provisions, everybody's entitled to their opinion. Even the honourable member said there's mixed reactions, so he obviously focused on the people that didn't like what's in there. But I would say what's one of the main provisions, one of the main head starts that you can get in politics is a financial head start. The other one is just plain old hard work, knocking on doors, doing all that kind of stuff. But so I'm not sure. I think would say the arguments that we heard are pretty weak. I would also say that talking about taking big money out, I mean, the NDP's number was 4,000. The number in this legislation is 5,000. Somehow, Mr. Speaker, the number 4,000 is magically good. Unbelievably great, and yet 5,000, according to the last speaker, is evil. How do you get from magically good to evil from 4,000 to 5,000? But the previous speaker, kind of made that leap. How the previous government's number was so fantastic, and this really not that much change number is somehow just beyond the pale. Super rich only can afford. Only the super rich. Everybody has 4,000, but only the super rich have 5,000. Now I'm not sure how many people at home actually believe that, Mr. Speaker. But I will tell you, when the previous government put the $4,000 number in, it was after a report came out from the previous elections numbers, and the sweet spot for the NDP donors was $4,000. So magically, at least where they got above that, they didn't get a lot, but 4,000 below. So obviously the goal of the previous government's legislation was to cut off support for other people, but not for themselves. Like caviar socialists. Caviar socialists, yes, that's one way to put it. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm highly entertained by that. I'm particularly amused by the fact the previous speaker didn't mention the fact that they left one big loophole where unions, who actually are part of the NDP board, could go and put money into an election, and this legislation doesn't allow that anymore, Mr. Speaker. But the honourable member kind of missed that little detail. Might be because it's in the NDP's best interest, maybe not, Mr. Speaker, but he conveniently didn't bring that up. So, Mr. Speaker, they talked about fair and equitable. I'll tell you what's fair and equitable is the rules apply to everybody, and that they can go out and do the work. This legislation applies for that. And I would say to the honourable member, he might want to reconsider some of the words he said just now, because they don't really stand up to scrutiny.
Here.
Thank you, honourable members. Are there any other honourable members looking to join a debate? I see the honourable member for Edmonton Decore has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate the opportunity tonight to rise to speak to Bill 29, the Local Authorities Amendment Act. I almost wonder if I should be calling it the Local Authorities Pay to Play Amendment Act. But speaking of entertaining, I will admit the previous speaker was most entertaining. especially with some of his point of views. But like he said, he is allowed to have those, so I won't take those away from him. And so we've had a suite here of legislation tabled around elections, and I must say, I remember back to the 29th legislature, Mr. Speaker, and we had the opportunity to create a special select committee on ethics and accountability, and one of the tasks of that committee was to look at elections financing. And again, I know the member from Calgary-Hayes finds it very, very entertaining around that number that was chosen, because I specifically remember the members that were sitting in opposition at that time coming up with every single excuse to try to keep more money into elections. And it got to such a point where, and it's funny because, you know, I can recall throughout even this legislature a couple of times having the member from Calgary-Hayes, you know, finger wagging here over at us about how, well, we don't ever seem to want to show up to work. I remember those opposition members walking out. So, kind of rich when you start finger wagging with that kind of history. So my colleague from Calgary Buffalo talked about how, you know, we're being accused of thinking in the extreme. Well, I think the reason why is, look back in history, Mr. Speaker. Alberta once held the prestigious title when it came to elections financings of the Wild West of elections. And that certainly was not a title of endearment, I can tell you that. That's because elections finances were out of control in this province. Absolutely out of control. And so we tried through the committee to do some work around that, assuming members wouldn't walk out, and try to bring some of these numbers in check. And so comparing what we're seeing here in this, you know, to the $4,000 cap, that's $4,000 that one individual can spend in a year, period. Doesn't matter how many, you can spread that out in as many directions as you would like, but once you hit $4,000, that's it. And so, but here, when I look at this, $5,000 to any single candidate, to as many candidates as you choose anywhere in the province. That doesn't sound like $4,000 to me. I could take my $4,000 right now, spread it over 20 candidates. But that's all I can do. $5,000 over 20 candidates? I know I've been accused of, you know, math is hard, but even I figured this one out. This is about paying to play. We are, and I believe I've even seen this in a news report, we're bringing back the Wild West of elections. And then you start to couple that with all the other things in Bill 26 and Bill 27. You know, the member mentioned how we created so much chaos around third-party advertisers. The worst chaos ever. And yet you're upping the ante. We said, this is how much you can spend. You can spend it how you want. All you had to do was disclose where the money's coming from. That's it, period. No big deal. The reason we did that is because we didn't want to get any court challenges like we saw in other jurisdictions. And to the best of my knowledge, we haven't seen any here around that. because we were careful enough to make sure that that wouldn't happen. But now, here we are, we're seeing up to $350,000. Then up to, before you even have to really start disclosing anything. One thing I wouldn't mind touching on here, because I've heard this a few times. We start to hear all kinds of interesting comments around the unions and what they're donating. I remember in the 2019 election, Mr. Speaker, a big, bright, flashing billboard in Decorah that ran for quite some time. I can tell you it certainly wasn't promoting me. Anything but, and I'm willing to bet that big flashy billboard going on 24 hours a day was not cheap. So somebody was financing that. I know for a fact somebody was. Otherwise, I wouldn't probably be up there. One thing I would like to quickly touch on here is around keeping track of donors. So this is about allowing a candidate in this proposed legislation to focus on the election. Now, I am just going to simply assume that a newcomer coming in doesn't have any campaign team whatsoever, and they have to keep track of the donations. Well, if they're not going to have to worry about it till after the election, they're going to be able to keep track of their donors over the course of that election period? I remember first time running. And man, once you got into the heat of things, I was lucky if I could remember what I had for breakfast that morning. So maybe a little bit of an incentive to at least get one other person on your team to maybe write down quickly who's giving you money. You know, I've had the opportunity to help an individual become a city councillor, and he was the newcomer. And I'll tell you right now, I had to work my tail off because there was another one that was coming up hard. And then surprise, surprise, in the last election in my area, a newcomer comes in, and he won from the incumbent. Winning my election, Mr. Speaker, just like you did in this past one, probably had to work your tail off as well. Absolutely. And in 2015, I was lucky enough, worked hard enough. I built a team around me that worked hard enough. And I was fortunate enough to unseat a two-term incumbent. I didn't need any advantage. Didn't need any special financing rules. Matter of fact, I was playing back in the rules when it was the Wild West, but managed to get it done. And I was fortunate enough, you know. I think we spent, I believe it was $15,000 on that campaign. So you can't tell me it can't be done. This is about paying to play and influencing the outcomes of how they're going to turn out by donating incredible amounts of money. And, you know, to the other point, no, I don't have any donors that can just drop $4,000. They throw me $100 here, $200 there. I get a few. I've had a few, whole $500. Woohoo! Rocking now. But $5,000? So all I see here, Mr. Speaker, in Bill 29 is yet another attempt to keep more money in elections. And when you combine it with all the other suites, with the referendums, the Senate stuff, all I'm seeing is taking these elections, and I think we're going to potentially turn them into a bit of a gong show. Let the local elections do what they do. The system wasn't broken, Mr. Speaker. And so, as I was saying, 5,000 to any single candidate, to multiple candidates anywhere, paying to play. And so it starts to beg some questions. And I know my friend from Edmonton, McClung, had mentioned some of these things around the consultations. Because I, too, want to know, what were those results? Why don't you just put them out there? Let everybody see it. Oh, wait, we like to hide those kinds of things, as we just saw in the Private Members Committee. My friend from Calgary, Buffalo, who happens to serve as the municipal affairs critic, has been reaching out to local municipalities. I've seen on social media from different local representatives. Some of them aren't liking some of the parts they're seeing of this. So if supposedly you consulted, or was it you just consulted with certain individuals? Maybe release some of that information. Then we'll know. When we're talking about connecting with people from underrepresented groups, again, what did you find out? What did you hear? Is it reflected in this bill? I don't know, I can't tell. You haven't released any information around that. In a way, Mr. Speaker, I would almost challenge the government to shut me up. Say, here's the information. See, it's actually in the legislation. But based on the track record, I haven't exactly going to hold out any hope for that kind of a thing. And so, I guess I could say that, you know, any campaign surpluses getting donated to charity, that could potentially be a good thing. Let's hope that somebody doesn't disagree with somebody's choice of a charity. You know, we've now seen some legislation where they're telling unions, oh, well, you have to disclose how much you're going to be putting towards political activism. Well, but then here we are going to a charity. Maybe it's possible somebody just might not like that charity that that candidate donates any surplus to. It's possible. Constantly I'm seeing conflicting language and information around these things. So it's very, very difficult, Mr. Speaker, to try to support legislation when we have experts saying this takes us backwards. This is not a good place that we're going to. Hope is maybe as we move this towards committee of the whole, we'll get a chance maybe to bring some amendments forward. I think what was the favorite line I used to hear when I sat on the other side? Maybe making a piece.
Thank you, Honourable Member. 29-2A is available for brief comments or questions. I believe I see the Honourable member for Calgary Buffalo has risen on
I know my
29-2A.
colleague was just in the midst of talking about how amendments brought forward can perhaps improve this bad bill. I wonder if he'd like to finish his thoughts.
The honourable member for Edmonton Decorah.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate my colleague from Calgary Buffalo allowing me an opportunity. Yeah, hopefully, we can potentially make a piece of, quite frankly, several pieces of bad legislation less bad. You used to always hear that. Oh, we're just here to help. We're trying to make bad legislation less bad. Well, and it's not just us saying it. That's the thing. That this is not the world according to me. Others are saying this. And no, they're not affiliated with the NDP. So you can park that one. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, elections are supposed to be about big ideas, not big pocketbooks. And Bill 29 is going to be about big pocketbooks and coming into elections and paying to play. And at the end of the day, I think, Mr. Speaker, the ones that are really going to end up paying are the electors themselves, because they're not going to be able to see themselves reflected in the candidates that get put into positions simply because they had really big donors.
Thank you, Honourable Member. With about 3 minutes left on 29-2A, I see the Honourable Premier has risen.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for his remarks, but I must confess to being somewhat mystified by his assertion that radical reforms to democratize Alberta constitute, I think he said, a gong show or an attack on democracy as characterized by the NDP, in which he enumerated referendums and Senate elections. We saw the bizarre spectacle in this place recently of his leader attacking as, quotes, undemocratic and anti-democratic the bill which would expand the ambit of government-initiated referendums from those limited to constitutional amendments to matters of broader public interest of a non-constitutional nature. I think most Albertans find it peculiar, Mr. Speaker, that a party with the word democratic in its title would be so viscerally opposed to the most democratic forms of decision-making. So let's break this down. They are opposed to the government referring to the people for direct votes through referenda matters of broad public interest. They are opposed to allowing Albertans to select their nominees for the Senate of Canada. Apparently they prefer that the Prime Minister, by fiat, should be able to determine who represents Albertans in the upper chamber of our Parliament. I assume they oppose, right now we can hear their opposition to this bill, apparently, opposition to reforms that limit the extraordinary advantage that municipal incumbents have in elections. They prefer legislation that protects incumbents and disadvantages outsiders and challengers. Theirs is a party, Mr. Speaker, that wrote election laws that allowed their allied union affiliates to spend millions of dollars on through political action committees. They laugh, including the Alberta Federation of Labour, which is legally a constituent affiliate of the NDP, through a loophole in their legislation, was able to spend millions of dollars on behalf of the NDP, a total violation of any sense of equity in Alberta election law. They apparently oppose, Mr. Speaker, I gather, the right of citizens to recall members of the legislature if they fail to be accountable to their constituents, a right that this government fully intends to legislate this year. Apparently they oppose, as being anti-democratic, the right of citizens to initiate referenda on important matters of public interest legislation that will be introduced by this government, further to recommendations from a legislature panel. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of this government's action to provide real democratic reforms and appalled by the NDP's opposition to them.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud has risen for debate on Bill 29.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today in second reading of Bill 29, the Local Authorities Amendment Act 2020. And in fact, I actually would like to thank the Honourable Premier for his comments just before I started to speak, because it actually clarifies for me exactly, again, what this government's primary focus is on, which is on distraction. Mr. Speaker, because they actually can't deliver on what they've promised in their campaign, which is jobs, economy, pipelines. We've seen a catastrophic loss of jobs in this province before the pandemic hit, before the epic oil drop in prices. $50,000 or 50,000 jobs lost under this Premier's first year as a result of his $4.7 billion corporate handout. And of course, I can appreciate that the Premier doesn't want Albertans talking about that. I think he's doing his very best, actually, Mr. Speaker, to actually distract Albertans from that, because his record thus far, and considering that his plan going forward is to just do more of the same, double down on corporate handouts which haven't produced any jobs and have actually just giving away Albertans' dollars that were going to fund their public services. And so, of course, distract by that by introducing a slew of bills that are really just throwing a bone to the base of the government's party, the UCP. I know he's got a very anxious group of supporters who are eager to talk about separatism, eager to talk about Wexit, and he's got to give them some things to preoccupy themselves with right now, Mr. Speaker. So I think it's pretty clear that when we're looking at Bill 29, the Local Authorities Amendment Election Act, this is just more of that, Mr. Speaker. It's more of distractions, throwing some things to his base. He knows that bringing back big money into municipal politics, into referendums, Senate elections, that's all about throwing a bone to his base. And of course, you know what, honestly, I don't blame the Premier, because he doesn't have much else to talk about that's good news for Albertans. In fact, everything he's talked about since he's come into power has really been bad news for Albertans. It's been increases in taxes, increases in fees, it's been cuts to their public services, it's been bad announcement one after the other under this Premier's watch, so of course he's going to distract. So I'm not surprised that here we are at a critical point in economic recovery in our province, focusing by the Premier's watch on things that are not going to make any difference or are going to make life harder for Albertans, that he's going to distract by bringing through a bunch of legislation to bring back big money into politics. So I think it was actually quite apt that just before I got to speak, I got to hear the Premier once again try to distract and rile up his members and his caucus and his base by talking about the things that he can actually deliver on, which is more division, more big money in politics. What he can't deliver on is what he campaigned on, which is jobs, economy, and pipelines. But fine, you know, we're not part of the government, we're opposition. Government gets to decide what bills are introduced. I'm not surprised at bringing in forward bills to distract Albertans, so I will debate the bill that's before us today. So it wouldn't be my top choice, Mr. Speaker, to talk about bringing big money back into local politics. It would be my choice to talk about the ways to actually get Albertans back to work by investing in Albertans who are the economy. They're not something separate. It's about investing in workers and in families and in parents. But this Premier wants us to talk instead about big money in local politics. So let's do that, Mr. Speaker. So I'll walk through. It's actually been quite astounding to hear even the Minister of Transportation stand and speak about this bill when he doesn't seem to understand his own bill or his cabinet's own bill. You know, he talked about how it's only a $1,000 increase in donation allowances that are allowed under this new, going from $4,000 to $5,000. But of course, the Minister of Transportation took the time to read the bill, and I'm assuming he has. He's been a member of Cabinet for, well, not that long, but he's a member of Cabinet right now. I'm sure he's taken a look at that bill, and he'll know that, of course, the change that was made is not that individuals can only now donate $5,000 versus $4,000, because the previous cap was on a total donation cap on an individual in an entire election. So one individual could donate $4,000 total in a municipal election, spread across as many candidates as they want, or maybe all into one candidate. That was their choice, but there was a $4,000 hard cap. Now, of course, under the amendments brought forward today in Bill 29, an individual can donate to one candidate up to $10,000 because it's $5,000 before Election Day and $5,000 afterwards, and can also donate to as many candidates as they'd like. And therein lies the big difference, Mr. Speaker, which I'm certain the Minister of Transportation is aware of, and if he isn't, well, he is now, the difference between $4,000 hard cap and $10,000 per candidate, unlimited number of candidates. That's actually a huge difference. And actually, the amount of individuals who can afford spending a really unlimited amount of money in a municipal election, actually those are the very wealthiest. Some people, of course, would struggle to pay $4,000 or to donate $4,000. And it is probably, most people wouldn't hit that cap in a year or in an election. But certainly, far, far fewer Albertans could afford to spend $10,000 on an unlimited number of candidates, but that's certainly what the amendments under Bill 29 allow. So I think we need to be clear about what we're talking about here. Although I do give credit to the Minister of Transportation. He got a good guffaw out of his colleagues on that one. Unfortunately, it's not accurate, just like most of what the members opposite say is not accurate. Let's continue on with what's actually in this bill, which is that as well, one of the things, actually, I will give credit for, and I think my colleague, the member from Calgary-Buffalo.
I just do want to remind members of the House that you can't do indirectly what you cannot do directly. And I think we got very close to language that would cause disorder on that. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to remind all members to ensure that they do not walk so close to the line with regards to language that can cause disorder. If the honourable member could please continue.
Thank you for the reminder, Mr. Speaker. I do like to watch those lines. So I would like to actually commend one of the amendments that's been brought forward in Bill 29, which I believe my colleague, the member from Calgary-Buffalo, also commented on, which is I do actually think it's a good thing that individuals who run have to actually donate what's left over from their campaign afterwards. I think that's actually a very good change, and I think universally we've heard from a lot of individuals who've said, yeah, that is actually a good thing because it does prevent candidates from hoarding basically the money from their election and carrying that forward, which does actually provide a significant advantage to incumbents. And so I think I want to commend. I think that's probably a good change to make. But I do also really want to comment on some what we know about how changes to election disclosures or election contributions really affect who can run for office. And I think that's a really important part because as a new member of this Legislative Assembly who was elected last year, I know that when I was first thinking about running in a seat where there was no incumbent in the seat, the incumbent chose not to run again, but certainly one of the very first questions I had as a new candidate, as a woman of color, a woman of color with young kids, is I thought about, I don't know how to raise money. I haven't done this before, and it's quite intimidating, and I don't know how I could possibly raise the amount of money necessary to compete in a provincial election, and I was concerned about that. And it's actually, I think, one of the #1 concerns that a lot of candidates, new candidates, particularly women have, is about fundraising and how to go about doing that. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I have, prior to running for office, I was involved in organizations that tried to promote and encourage women to run for office. I'm still closely, when I'm asked to, I'm involved in those events and to serve as a mentor. And one of the most common questions I get asked by women who are looking or considering to run for office, particularly most recently in the municipal elections, I've spoken to a number of women across Edmonton and actually in Calgary who are considering running for office, is they're concerned about raising money. Because for a lot of them, they're not in a position to themselves contribute a lot of money. Often if they're running for office, they're considering going down to part-time work. Some of them are already working part-time because they have children at home, or they're thinking about having to take a leave from their job in order to run for office. And so one of the biggest concerns that they have is how do I run for office? How do I raise enough money? And how can I do that? How can I compete with somebody who can raise a lot more money? And I actually think that for myself, I took great comfort when I was running for office, to know that there was an even playing field, to know that every single person that I was running against had the same limits in terms of what they could spend on an election, which I know we don't have currently in municipal elections, and would be a little bit more challenging than municipal context because of the variety of different municipalities. But I knew I took comfort from those caps. I took comfort from the fact that I knew that whoever I was running against, or even myself, could not be unnecessarily or disadvantaged by the fact that there might be some donors who have much deeper pockets than others. Everybody, no matter who was going to donate, had a cap of $4,000 that they could donate to in any election. And I thought that at least leveled the playing field, and it gave me greater confidence to be able to run. And I'm not the only one who thinks that, Mr. Speaker. I know the member from Calgary-Buffalo raised this, but I'd like to bring forward a joint statement that was made by two organizations that focus specifically on getting more women to run in municipal politics. And that is Ask Her YYC, which is in Calgary, and Parity YEG, which is an organization here in Edmonton. And these two organizations came together and issued a joint statement on June 29th, 2020. And in there, they highlight what should be basic information. I think this should not be surprising information for any of the members of this House. And if it is, I'm a little disappointed. But I will say that they brought forward pretty standard information about the greater barriers that women face in terms of running for political office. And there's a number of reasons for that have existed for a long time. Likely, mostly because women tend to make less money than their partners. We still know that there is a huge gap in wages between men and women in this province. They are less likely to be participating already in the workforce, so they feel like they're less able to make the financial leap to run for office. We know that women predominantly take on the lion's share of caregiving, caring for children, and that is, of course, unpaid labor. And so there's also additional barriers, of course, that women face when they're thinking about running for office. A lot of that has to do with the often toxic nature of social media and politics, which I have to say I used to counsel women who are thinking about running for office before I ran, and said, oh, I think that's all manageable. But I have to say that is a very significant barrier. After being in office now for over a year, I can attest to the fact that that is a very discouraging factor for women to run for politics, is the toxicity of social media. But I do want to highlight that in this joint statement by Ask Her YYC and Parity YEG, these two organizations lay out that there are these significant economic obstacles for women candidates that have actually been exacerbated, of course, by COVID-19. Because as all the members on this side of the House know, we've been talking about it repeatedly, and in fact, we're only echoing what we're hearing from economists and Stats Canada, which is that women have been hit hardest by the pandemic in terms of job losses, hours of reduction in hours of work, an increase in terms of unpaid caregiving. And in this statement, these two organizations highlight, and this is a quote, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be happy to table this at a later date, but they quote that before COVID-19, unemployment rates were only marginally higher for women. Since the pandemic began, 14% of men who lost their jobs have regained their employment compared to only 5.4% of women in similar situations. This compounds the existing socioeconomic disadvantages women are already facing. And the statement goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, that actually this statement was issued in response to Bill 29. And it goes on to say, research shows that most campaign finance regulations have not engaged in gender-based analysis and fail to notice impacts that disadvantage women's participation and primarily benefit men as incumbents. We know that women are more likely to succeed when elections include limits on campaign expenditures and donations, higher transparency requirements, and limitations on third-party advertising, and as such, strongly believe their recommendations to amend Bill 29 should be taken under consideration. Now, honestly, Mr. Speaker, this statement by Parity YEG and Ask Her YYC, as somebody who has been immersed in trying to encourage more women to run for office, this is actually common knowledge. This should, by now, all members of this assembly should be aware of the barriers that women face to running for office. The Premier himself stood up in the campaign and claimed that he really wanted to work on promoting women to run for office. So we should all acknowledge on this, on both sides of the House, that there is a barrier to women participating in politics, and we have an obligation to try to encourage greater diversity and gender parity in politics. And yet, I have to say, I was extremely disheartened right now when the Minister of Transportation was speaking in response to comments from the member from Calgary-Buffalo, who asked that question about the changes that are in Bill 29 make it so that those with the deepest pockets and those who are wealthiest, which disadvantages female candidates. This raises an issue of fairness and equitability. It actually moves us backwards in terms of promoting women and other individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds to participate in the political sphere. And the response from the Minister of Transportation was, quote, "It's fair and equitable because the rules apply to everybody." So that answers my question right there, Mr. Speaker. It answers the questions of Parity YEG and Ask Her YYC as to whether or not this government has done a gender-based analysis, something that, by the way, was standard practice when the NDP were in power, was to look at policy and legislation that's brought forward to see whether or not an analysis has been done to see whether or not the impacts, unintended or intended, have an impact disproportionately on women. And it's very clear from the response from the Minister of Transportation. And I hope when the Minister responsible for the status for women can stand up, she can talk about the gender-based analysis that was done with respect to Bill 29, because I think right now we can say with fair degree of certainty that no gender-based analysis was done on this. Because if it was, we certainly wouldn't have statements like we just heard from the Minister of Transportation.
Honourable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton, Highlands, Norwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I had to jump in here, not only because the member from Edmonton Whitemud is so passionate and so knowledgeable, but also this is an issue that's quite close to my heart. Like the member from Edmonton Whitemud, I too, have taken it to be a pretty important responsibility to encourage women and gender diverse folks to get involved in politics, and was involved with some of the organizations that are pushing that mission as well. And I must also state I'm concerned about the issues raised by Ask Her YYC and by Parity YEG, who've both pointed out in their joint statement that this Bill 29, as written, really will add additional barriers for women and for underrepresented groups in politics. So this is an opportunity for this government to maybe reflect upon what's in that bill as it is laid out in front of us. I'm hoping that, as the member from Calgary-Buffalo spoke about, we'll have an opportunity to introduce some amendments that I really hope that this government considers. And I would say, echoing the comments from the member from Edmonton Whitemud, we've got a minister right now for the status of women who has claimed to be an advocate for encouraging more women and gender diverse folks in politics. Yet, was she at the cabinet table advocating for those very same folks when Bill 29 was presented? I'm not sure. I'm hoping she'll get on the record and she'll speak to that. I also want to echo the comments around gender-based analysis. I've asked this government, I've asked both that minister and the premier and the finance minister about how women's voices, women's needs are being centered in this economic recovery. And to date, that question has been ignored, the question has been mocked. We've asked about minimum wage workers, we've asked about low-wage workers, which are disproportionately women. Again, we haven't got an answer. So Bill 29 seems to be continuing with that trend. I want to throw it back to the member from Edmonton Whitemud, though. I'd like her to just finish her thought. She was just talking about gender-based analysis and talking about the need for this government to take this seriously. So I'll throw it over to her.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood. I'm glad you reminded me actually what I was speaking about when I stopped speaking, because actually I was mesmerized by what you were saying. So thank you for that, member. Yes, I wanted to say that I too have significant concerns about whether or not gender-based analysis was done on this bill. I think the answer is at least not while the Minister of Transportation was sitting around the table, but I am hoping that at least we'll hear perhaps from the Minister of Municipal Affairs either during second reading or during committee of the whole, should this pass second reading to talk about the consideration he gave to how the changes that are proposed in Bill 29 affect women and affect people from disadvantaged backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, and how increasing the amount of donations that can be made by any individual to candidates, and as well as increasing the amount of third-party donations will actually impact the ability of women and those from socioeconomic backgrounds, disadvantaged backgrounds, to actually run for office. I would love to know the detailed analysis, who was consulted with and who that was discussed with, because we have here some credible organizations who are raising significant concerns, and I don't see and I don't feel any confidence right now that this government has taken that into consideration. And as we continue to shut women out of the economy and its recovery, I hope we're not also going to be shutting them out even further from the political process and from engagement, because I can tell you right now, if there's ever been a better example of why we need gender-based analysis, it is the current government, because they seem to continue to take actions which demonstrate that they are ignoring the disproportionate impacts and the disadvantaged nature of the impacts of the work that they're doing on women. And they can continue to say that when they work on one sector of the economy, which is an important sector of the economy, that will somehow trickle down to women, that there will be ancillary jobs, that there will somehow mothers and parents will figure out how to go back to work when they don't have childcare or schools are not reopened. They're continuing to say that they are not listening to the voices of women. And now more than ever, we need more women in politics who are actually raising those issues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, we are on second reading of Bill 29, the Local Authorities Election Amendment Act 2020. Is there anyone else wishing to join in the debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Beverly Clairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise this evening and speak to Bill 29. And, you know, at the onset, Mr. Speaker, I do just want to give a shout out to my colleague, the previous speaker, as well as to all of my colleagues this evening for each bringing a different focal lens to this bill and to provide their perspective. And again, we know as legislators in this chamber that all 87 of us are constantly engaging with Albertans at every turn. And so when we do rise to speak, we often try to include those perspectives and comments. And I think it's really important, you know, the focus of my colleague from Edmonton Whitemud talking about the impact of this bill on, especially on women and women trying to enter into local politics and the challenges that they face above and beyond, quite frankly, what the majority of men face in running for local office, and all of the different facets that are involved when a person puts their name forward. So I want to commend my colleague for her very articulate, passionate speech raising her concerns. And I also want to, and I will note, Mr. Speaker, obviously I'm not about to break custom and talk about members that are absent or present, but I do appreciate that the Minister of Municipal Affairs has been attentively listening to comments from the opposition. That is greatly appreciated. I attempted to do the same when I was a minister, and so I think it's important to have a good, healthy discussion about the legislation in order to try to identify how it can be improved. I mean, that's really why we have this chamber. I mean, it's part of our democratic process, but it's also equally important that we strive to improve it. So I hope that the minister will entertain amendments that the opposition puts forward. I can commit to him that we will endeavour to get those amendments to him as early as possible, recognizing that a minister needs time to go through them. But hopefully that's in the realm of possibilities. And so, you know, I'll say at the onset, Mr. Speaker, this is amendments and changes to Local Authorities Elections Act is something that I think a lot of different governments have wrestled with. I know before we formed government, the PCs leading up to 2015 looked at changes to this legislation. I know we looked at changes to this legislation in consultation with municipalities, recognizing that the timing is absolutely critical. You can't wait too soon before a municipal election to bring in changes, because of course that has a significant impact on all of the folks who run there. And so, and this is something that I did look at when I held the office of municipal affairs as well. And so, I'm happy to start off, Mr. Speaker, just mentioning some of the elements in this bill that I agree with. And that I will, my colleague, the member for Calgary Mountain View, had said, and I've always said this, and I know the Minister of Transportation will know because we've been in this place together for many years, that I'm happy to give credit where credit's due. I'm happy to critique where I feel that things could be improved. But in this bill, the fact that we're ensuring campaign surpluses are donated to charity, I think, is significant. This is a reset of the clock for candidates that are choosing to run. I know from talking, especially with incumbents from the larger cities that have war chests, of some are actually over $100,000, but a significant amount of money that puts them on unequal footing from a new candidate. And again, I think this chamber is a great example of the number of men and women who decided to run in the last election. We had a significant turnover. And I think to an extent that's healthy for democracy, Mr. Speaker, that we get some new blood in this place, new ideas. That's not to say that people should be knocking off the Minister of Infrastructure or Transportation and myself and others, but it is good. We want to encourage more Albertans and more people to run for office. I think that's how we ensure that we get the best ideas in this place. So I do, and I'm glad that I mentioned I'm happy about that change, and I support that 100%. That the surpluses are also donated to charity. And sorry, I meant to mention that. So I think that's fantastic. But I do have some concerns with this legislation. And I will provide some comments from some of the mayors that I've been in contact with from around the province, some of the concerns they have. And so again, I hope that the minister is continuing to reach out to mayors and councillors across the province to hear their thoughts on these changes that are quite significant, Mr. Speaker. The fact that, so the removal of the $4,000 limit on annual contributions to local campaigns and the increase to $10,000 per candidate, I actually, and that's before and after polling day. So that's a significant jump, more than doubling that allotment or that allowance of room. And so the other question I have, and I was speaking with another honourable member about this, so the move from 4,000 to 10,000, was that also for corporations or third parties, or is that only for individuals? And I haven't pulled that answer out of the bill yet. So I'm hoping in committee of the whole that the minister can speak about that. Are we talking about only personal contribution limits that have changed, or does that also impact either corporations or third parties in what they can donate directly? I'm not talking about PACs. I think what's interesting, and I would love to hear the background on this, Mr. Speaker, allowing individuals to donate up to $5,000, and again, that's up from $4,000, I appreciate that, but to an unlimited number of municipal and school board candidates before polling day. And I'm curious if that was actually in the previous legislation, or if that is something new. Now, for me, the really big flag, and this will, I believe Albertans will also want to know, the fact that there's a removal of the ability for local authorities to pass a bylaw on disclosure of where these funds are coming from. So it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to increase the amounts that people can donate. We may disagree with that, but fair enough. Where it becomes suspicious and where flags go up, Mr. Speaker, is when you suddenly remove even the ability of municipalities to say, no, you know what? We want our candidates to be beholden to the citizens of our community, not to random anonymous donors. The problem with this, Mr. Speaker, is that it could be a group of, for example, wealthy individuals that decide that they want to influence the election elections in a number of different ridings and jurisdictions across the province. Now, let's not mince words on the fact that money and campaign contributions and war chests influence significantly the outcome of an election. And anybody that tries to stand up and say money's irrelevant in elections, it doesn't matter how much you spend, you've obviously never run, or you must be Pinocchio, because dollars do influence the outcome of elections. I think citizens, voters, have the right to know where those dollars are coming from. And I think, when we go outside of Calgary and Edmonton, and I appreciate, again, in the two cities, many candidates will spend upwards of $80,000 to $100,000 on their campaigns, a significant amount of money. In your other municipalities and jurisdictions, they are spending a tiny fraction of that. They are not coming near that amount of money. But, Mr. Speaker, if you have a group of well-off individuals throughout the province, so nowhere near maybe a rural, remote community in Alberta, but they decide that they want their person to be elected, they can get together and throw, $5,000, $10,000 into a kitty, and suddenly that candidate that ran in the last election against competitors that all spent about $1,000 now has a $50,000 war chest and has significant influence over the outcome of that election. And the issue that I have, Mr. Speaker, is one, it is not accountable, it is not transparent, it flies in the face of our fundamental rights and freedoms that we celebrate in our democratic system, because it's money that's untraceable, and we have no idea where that came from. But it also disempowers the very voters that these individuals are running to represent. You're now allowing people in other parts of the province to have a significant influence over the outcome of a local election. And that, Mr. Speaker, I have an issue with. Because, again, money is extremely powerful in elections. And, I can't support that. And more so, I would love for the minister or members of the government to disclose or share with this House and with Albertans, where is this idea coming from? You're not only saying you don't have to disclose, you're removing the ability of a local municipality. You're disempowering them. You're not just playing Big Brother you're saying to municipalities, even if you wanted to try to pass a bylaw that would force donations to be disclosed and where they came from, you're taking that away from them. What are you hiding? What are you hiding? The only way that you would possibly bring this into a bill is if you wanted to intentionally hide where money is coming from. And that, Mr. Speaker, I have a real issue with. That flies in the face of democracy. As far as, Mr. Speaker, allowing candidates to self-finance up to $10,000, that's a large amount of money, Mr. Speaker. That's a significant amount of money. The fact that now we are providing an advantage to those who have deeper pockets over those that don't. And again, I'm sorry, there isn't an argument to be made that this helps create a level playing field. No, it doesn't. $10,000 per candidate is a significant amount of money. The last time I checked, we want to encourage everyone, no matter the color of your skin, who you worship, your faith, your gender, your identity. We want every person to have an equal opportunity to run for office. This is what I tell grade 6 students when I go and talk to them, that anyone can run for office. This is one of the pillars of our democracy. But I'm telling you, Mr. Speaker, when you have an allotment or an increase or an ability for candidates with money to self-finance up to $10,000, the playing field is no longer level. You have now tipped the scales in favor of those with deeper pockets. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, when I taught at Inner City High School, and I taught at that school between 2006 and 2012 before I first got elected, I had students that were incredibly intelligent and articulate. But the system chewed them up and spat them up. And they struggled with barriers that the majority of Alberta students will never have to deal with. And tragedy that they'll never have to deal with. And I remember talking to one of my social studies classes. I taught high school English and social studies and phys ed. And I had a student that was passionate about wanting to make a difference and said, you know what, I think I'm going to run one day for city council. And I said, you know what, good for you. And it was a young man that had struggled with addiction. He struggled with a number of different challenges, but one of the smartest people that I had ever met. Incredibly intelligent and passionate and a good person. And I think, I still hope that one day he will run. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, because of his challenges with housing, with struggling to keep a job, that this will be a barrier for him to run and will be an advantage to his opponents who have the dollars to be able to self-finance up to $10,000. Now, I recognize that there are, I'm sure, members that will say, well, he can still fundraise. Yes, he can. But the $10,000 is a significant amount, especially for individuals who aren't in the big cities.
Honourable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. If anyone has a brief question or comment, I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton McClung has one.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under 29-2A, I would like to invite the member to continue comments, but I wanted him to perhaps expand in a couple of different areas. I know that, Mr. Speaker, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and this morning's newspaper headlines in the Edmonton Journal were about the Misericordia, an acute care hospital in my constituency, which is now not accepting new patients except for emergencies and women giving birth because of an outbreak of COVID-19 at that hospital. And of course, that shows how fragile our hospital situations are and how fragile our healthcare system can be because of this pandemic. We're in this global pandemic coupled with an economic downturn, yet this government seems to be intent on bringing legislation that will be more of a smokescreen than anything else at this time, because they really don't want to turn their attention to the economic solutions that aren't working in their government policy package. They seem to think that if we shovel enough tax dollars to profitable corporations, $4.7 billion here, $7.5 billion to a pipeline that's going nowhere is there, that the same rules, the mere miraculously jobs will appear, just as though spring happens every year. Well, indeed, that doesn't seem to be the case, and I'd like the member to see if he can expand on that a little bit, and also talk about smaller communities, Mr. Speaker, about how this affects the electoral process in smaller communities. When you get $5,000 in a village as small as maybe Thorhild, where I spent some time on Thursday, and that type of influence that it can wield in those small communities throughout rural Alberta.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Beverly Clareview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll thank the member for his question. I must say at the onset I was a little confused where he was going with that. But I appreciate the fact that what he's doing is painting a picture of the current state of the economy and the impact it's having on so many Albertans. And so with this sudden significant increase to how campaigns can be funded municipally, this is a concern. And I'm going to run out of time, and I will, when we get into committee, there's a number of other comments I want to make. But to the member from Edmonton McClung's point, I encourage all members in this chamber, especially rural MLAs, to go out and talk to your local city, municipal, your MDs, your counties. Talk to your elected officials and ask them how much they spent in the last municipal election. And from the comments I'm hearing from mayors, they're often self-funded or they raise a few $100s, maybe a couple thousand. That is it. What this bill is allowing is for individuals who don't live anywhere near those communities to significantly influence the outcome of those campaigns. That is not creating a level playing field. That's not enhancing democracy. That's doing the opposite. That's putting power in the hands of those who can afford to make significant contributions all over the province to communities that they don't live in. And so, you know, I would love to hear from the Premier. Let's hear your secret plan to take over the municipal councils all over the province. Because what this bill does is it takes the ability and the democracy out of the hands of local people. But I would love to hear from MLAs, and I will be reaching out, our team will be reaching out to municipal councillors all over the province to find out how much did you spend last election and how will this bill help you in the next election. And I'm going to venture a guess that the majority outside of Edmonton and Calgary and some of the larger cities will tell you the elections are not influenced by outside campaign contributors and are very small budgets. So I can't accept the argument that this bill strengthens democracy. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it does quite the opposite. And I hope that the minister will entertain some of the amendments that the official opposition will be bringing forward on this. And I will talk when we get into committee of the whole, because I fear my time is almost up, that I want to talk about a number of other issues, this bill along with Bill 26 and what they do when they're taken together.
Honourable members, Bill 29, its second reading, is available for debate. If anyone would like to provide additional question or comments. The Honourable Member for Calgary McCall, then. Glad we could.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak to Bill 29, Local Authorities Amendment Act. We have seen three pieces of legislation, Bill 26, 27, and 29. And government messaging on all three pieces is kind of same, that they are strengthening democracy. But the way we see it, where the bill read, I think these bills are not strengthening democracy in any way, shape, or manner. Rather, they are corrupting democracy with big money, with dark money. And that bill is exactly doing the same. This is an important piece of legislation. It has implications for our local elections. It has implications how things are managed in our local municipalities, in our neighborhoods. It affects everyone in each of our ridings. And on a matter of such important public policy, government has not done any consultations that we know of. And if there are any consultations, I think we would love to hear what those consultations were, who was consulted, what they said. But instead, what we have seen, that government did conduct a survey about this legislation. And government invited Albertans to participate in that survey and express their views with respect to these Local Authorities Act with respect to election in our local municipalities. But those results were never released. So it makes us wonder what government is actually hiding. Were these changes not supported by the feedback they got from the people? That's the only reason I can think of that they chose not to share or release the result of those surveys. And on something of such importance that deals with our local democracy, deals with our basic democracy, I think we all need to know what public said. And when we talk to our constituents in our local communities, I think we didn't hear that government engaged with any of them. Like I represent a riding which has a number of organizations, community-based organizations, ethnic organizations, religious faith-based organizations, and I didn't hear from any one of them that government reached out to them to consult on a matter of this important matter which will affect their communities. And for most part, it will affect adversely their communities because the changes that government is undertaking with this piece of legislation are not strengthening the democracy. They are not to encourage participation. They're not to level the playing field. These changes are tilting the balance in favor of those with big, deep pockets. For instance, there was a limit of $4,000 annual contribution to local campaigns. I think most Albertans would not be able to even contribute that $4,000, let alone $4,000 to every candidate running in the municipality. And they're now changing that limit to $10,000 before and after the polling day. So that's effectively $20,000. And when you organize election under such laws, then election is not about ideas, it's about big money who has more money. It doesn't encourage participation. It doesn't even encourage candidates to go to their constituents and ask for their support. Because when you go out in your communities, when you ask everyday families for support, they will ask you, what's your platform? What do you think about the issues that matter to them? And if they agree with you, they will give you money, they will support you. But in this case, I think they are just enabling big money to hijack democratic process with their big dark money. And as Mayor of Calgary, Mayor Nenshi, identified that these changes where individuals will be allowed to donate up to $5,000 to as many candidates as they want, I think will again help conservatives who previously have tried to take over city council, to take over elections of school boards. And there was in last school board election that there was a slate of candidates. Out of 7, there were 4 candidates who were backed by conservatives. And before, you can only give $4,000. Now, if there is such a slate, you can give each candidate $5,000. So this law, this change is actually designed to further that agenda that they tried in the last election. How does it levels the playing field when one individual in Calgary can donate $70,000 in 14 wards? Again, that law will facilitate if some group of rich people want to influence Calgary city election, they can choose 8 wards and give $5,000 each and essentially influence the outcome of local democracy. So it's not in any way, shape, or manner strengthening democracy. It's eroding democracy. It's getting money back into the process that we took out. Second thing, I think it's doing exactly the same thing with school board elections, where in previous school trustee election, conservatives openly backed a slate of candidates that were conservative. And now with this election, with this change in these election laws, they will be better positioned to support that slate of candidates with $5,000 each. So again, this change is designed to influence the outcome of local election, not strengthen local democracy. And also, they're removing local authorities' ability to pass any safeguards, but any safeguards there to require campaigns to disclose their financial donations pre-election. I think Albertans have every right to know how these election campaigns are run, who is behind these slate of candidates, who is supporting whom. And democracy is nothing without transparency. And here, again, the government is making a deliberate effort to hide that big money while they influence these local campaigns, school board campaigns, municipal campaigns. And they're also allowing candidates to self-finance up to $10,000, and they can also self-finance after the campaign for another $10,000. That's a huge sum of money. How this change in any way, shape, or manner is leveling the playing field. For instance, I came to Canada 15, 16 years ago. In the riding I represent, is predominantly those who are newcomers, who are starting a new life. And I think I would be interested in knowing from the minister that how changing these contribution limits help newcomers participate in election. If elections were about ideas, I'm sure there are many people out there who may be new to this country, but they come with a lot of experience. They come with a lot of background and knowledge. But if money will be a precondition to participate in democracy, I don't think many of them will ever even think about participating in democracy. And if we are talking about strengthening democracy, strengthening participation, then we should be talking about how newcomers, how those individuals and groups who were marginalized for the longest time, how we can facilitate their participation in democracy. And this piece of legislation doesn't deal with that at all. And it's disappointing to see this at a time when world around us is trying to recognize the struggle of marginalized communities.
Honourable Member, Standing Order 29-2A is available. If anyone would like to provide a brief question or comment for the Honourable Member for Edmonton McCall.
No, I hadn't.
Seeing none, is there anyone else wishing to join in the debate this evening? On 29-2A?
No.
Okay. It appears that the Honourable Member for Calgary Gold Bar is rising to speak to the bill. Is that correct?
Yeah, Edmonton.
No, Mr. Speaker, it's the member from Edmonton Gold.
Wildly inappropriate of me. My deepest and most sincere apology to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I have to say that I love all of Alberta's people equally, but my constituents might be upset that you're confusing them for citizens of Calgary, Mr. Speaker, but I will go and apologize to them on your behalf if you would like that. It's a pleasure for me to rise and offer a few brief comments on Bill 29. I have a couple of comments that I would like to make on this bill, if I could. First of all, I want to comment on what this bill says about the priorities of this government, and secondly, I want to address the issue of trust, and specifically trust in this government to safeguard elections and the democratic process. Now, on the issue of priorities, I think all of us who have been here in this legislature have come to realize that no government has the time or the resources to deal with all of the issues that it wants to, that it could possibly address. And I know the government was elected on an incredibly ambitious agenda. We are reminded time and again of the hundreds and hundreds of pages of promises in the platform that they have to get through. And so we all recognize that any piece of legislation represents time taken away from other pieces of legislation and policy initiatives that the government can't do. So it's interesting to me that at a time when Alberta is in the middle of the worst economic depression since the 1930s, in the middle of a global pandemic that has killed hundreds of Albertans, made thousands more sick, that we are spending our time here in the legislature talking about local election financing. It's certainly not what my constituents have on the top of their mind when they are looking to the legislature to help them in their moment of need. Certainly the things that I'm hearing from my constituents about, the things that they're requesting the legislature deal with urgently, have nothing to do with local authority elections financing. They're very concerned about the quality of their health care, whether or not they can receive the medical care they need at the time they need it. They're concerned about the quality of their children's education. They're asking themselves what school is going to look like come September when it's time to resume classes. If they'll be able to go back, what kind of resources will be available to them? If they go back to school, what kind of resources will be available to them if homeschooling continues? Mobile learning. They're concerned about making rent at the end of the month, being able to pay their utility bills. They're concerned about finding a job, being able to put food on the table for their families. I have to say that if I had to ask my priorities what their top 100, if I had to ask my constituents what their top 100 priorities are for this legislature at this time, number 101 would be local authorities election financing. There are many, much more urgent issues that this legislature should be dealing with, and I think that many of my constituents are wondering why it is that the government is concerning itself, taking its time, dealing with local elections financing, and not dealing with these urgent matters. So the only thing that I can tell my constituents when they ask me why the government is spending its time dealing with local authorities elections financing is that this government is more concerned about making sure that its friends are looked after than they are concerned about whether or not everyday Albertans are looked after. That's why I think we're seeing these changes to the local authorities elections financing, is so that members opposite can allow the big money to flow into the campaigns of their friends and donors who are going to be seeking seats on city, town, municipal councils, school boards all across the province in the next series of local elections. And my constituents are incredibly frustrated with the lack of concern for everyday Albertans that this government has shown for them in their time of most urgent need. I have to say that if we had the opportunity to be setting the legislative agenda instead of responding to it, we'd be dealing with things a lot more differently. We dealt with the issue of local elections authority financing. There isn't really a problem there. I don't know why we need to be spending time that should be spent on these much more urgent priorities that I've earlier outlined, dealing with fixing a problem that doesn't exist. And I've heard the members opposite talk about our concerns for democracy, or they're projecting our lack of concern for democracy onto us. I have to say that those arguments ring a little bit hollow, Mr. Speaker, because we know that the stated issue, the stated reason that this government has brought forward this legislation is to give non-incumbents a level playing field when it comes to municipal elections. And so they're essentially reverting back to the financial campaign rules that were in place before we were elected in 2015. Well, Mr. Speaker, a very cursory review of the results of municipal elections prior to 2015 would indicate that incumbents had a major advantage in every municipal election prior to us making the changes to the local authorities' elections financing. So their stated goal of leveling the playing field is an argument that I don't buy, Mr. Speaker, because making these changes that they're proposing here in this legislation will not result in any more incumbents losing their seats in municipal elections, and they won't achieve this stated goal. So, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, I think that while I do think that elections financing is an important topic of debate, that this is probably not the right time for this legislature to be dealing with it. It's certainly frustrating for me to go back to the constituents of Edmonton Gold Bar to tell them that the government is really doing nothing to make sure that they have a job, or that they can make the rent, have a roof over their head, make sure that their schools, their kids' schools are functioning well, or that they'll have the health care they need if or when they get sick with COVID or any other kind of disease. So it's frustrating, but certainly the citizens of Edmonton Gold Bar have they didn't have very high expectations for this government when they were elected in 2019, and they are very used to being disappointed by the members opposite. So, you know, while it is hard for me to go back to the constituents and continue to tell them that this government is not doing the things they need to do to make their lives better, it's definitely getting to be a habit. And I think the citizens of Edmonton Gold Bar are keen to break that habit when they get the next chance to have their voices heard in a provincial election. And it's certainly not true, in my view, that the stated intent of this legislation will be met by the pieces of law that are represented in it. This will do nothing to make it easier for non-incumbents to win elections, because we're essentially reverting back to the financing rules that were in place before we took office in 2015. And everybody knows that those incumbents had a very easy time of winning re-election. So, Mr. Speaker, for those two reasons, I will not be supporting this piece of legislation, and I urge the government to stop worrying about their friends in the political sphere and start putting their minds to helping everyday Albertans in their time of need, and bring forward some meaningful legislation that will accomplish that objective. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I would move that we adjourn debate on Bill 29.
The motion as proposed by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar to adjourn debate. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. Motion is carried and so ordered. Whoa, things are about to get exciting. Van Dyken.
I would like to call the committee to order. The Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill 22, Red Tape Reduction Implementation Act 2020. Are there any comments, questions, or amendments to be offered at this time? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Decore has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the opportunity this evening to rise and add some comments around Bill 22. A very large piece of legislation here, Mr. Speaker. Matter of fact, Mr. Chair, when I first picked it up, I almost threw out my back. It was so big, which is kind of funny because Bill 22 is an omnibus piece of legislation brought forward by the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction, making changes across 6 ministries and 15, 16 different pieces of legislation. Some of those pieces of legislation are rather large. And so we have seen this government bring forward several, I've actually lost count now, of how many pieces of omnibus legislation that's been brought forward. And, you know, Mr. Chair, I can't help but think back to, May 30th in 2017, when I heard that this government is being disingenuous by lumping together changes to both labor relations codes and the employment standards code into one big omnibus bill. And of course, that happened to have been the Associate Minister for Red Tape Reduction. And, you know, there were many other members at that time that rose to speak against the government of the day bringing forth omnibus legislation. Of course, the one that I had just mentioned was all within one ministry alone. Granted, there was some changes, but it was only one ministry, not multiple ministries that we're seeing here today here with Bill 22. And that one was only 124 pages. So I guess I can't help, Mr. Chair, but wonder, when you hear comments like that and then we see legislation like this here in Bill 22, was the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction not really on board with his whole comments around omnibus legislation? Were the members that also criticized that omnibus piece of legislation not really on board with their comments back then? That's the only thing I can think of, because I've seen multiple pieces of omnibus legislation like Bill 22 come before us in this legislation that members were clearly opposed. And of course, that was the members that of the government benches and of the government caucus that served in the 29th legislature. But nonetheless, we are here today with another piece of omnibus legislation brought forward here by the UCP government. 175 pages, and I have to say, Mr. Chair, watching the initial announcement of this legislation was entertaining. I'm trying to be nice here. Because it seemed when journalists wanted to ask questions about this legislation, all we kept seeing was the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction saying, well, you'll have to check with the relevant minister. Oh, you'll have to check with the relevant minister. You better go ask the relevant minister. I don't know why the relevant ministers maybe weren't present at that time to help him out. Because, you know, right in the title, Red Tape Reduction Implementation Act 2020. This is his bill, and couldn't speak to it virtually at all, except for a few talking points about we're reducing red tape, 1/3, you know, getting out of the way, and all this great stuff, but couldn't answer anything else about it. Matter of fact, I even stood up in question period to ask some very technical questions, even referring to the sections and pages, and I got the same tired talking points at that time. Now, I will give credit where credit's due. He offered to meet with me at any time. His door was open. And so I took him up on the offer, and I actually did finally get answers to those. But it would have been nice to maybe get those answers right off the hop, Mr. Chair, because, when I initially started looking at Bill 22, and I'm seeing things like removal of language around insider trading. I mean, quick look, that just sends off some amazing alarm bells. And yet, a situation like that develops, and then the government wonders why we start to get worried about what they're bringing forth to Albertans in other pieces of legislation. I guess perhaps maybe a technical briefing would have helped at the time, especially given the size and complexities of this bill, just in the Corporations Act alone. And so, that being said, the bill, of course, provides more ministerial powers that members who served in the 29th legislature, who are part of the government bench right now, part of the government caucus, were very upset whenever they felt that was being done with the previous government. So was it really a case then that they weren't really on board with what they were saying? And it's a recurring theme that keeps coming up with regards to that. Some of the changes in here, again, I think probably could have been addressed through a Statutes Amendment Act. And so I can't help but wonder, are we bringing forward these changes through Bill 22, a red tape reduction bill, to justify to Albertans why we need to spend $13 million of taxpayers' money on this ministry? Especially at a time when people are seeing things like their insurance rates go up, they're seeing their utility rates go up, they're being bogged down in more debt because of decisions made by the government on how best to handle the pandemic that we went through and are still currently going through. Because we said, well, we'll let you defer your utility rates and pay interest on top of that. And so, I have people that are asking me, well, why are they spending $13 million on this ministry when I have to go through that? I don't have an answer for them, Mr. Chair. I said, well, I guess if you're trying to justify spending those kinds of dollars, well, you got to throw in anything you can to try and make it work. And again, it's not something that we haven't seen before with red tape reduction legislation. Simple things that probably could have been done, probably even through just the ministries themselves. Why do we need an actual standalone ministry? I've clearly seen ministers on the front bench making moves towards reducing red tape, or at least what they feel is red tape at times. And I think they're doing it all by themselves. So maybe we could have redirected that $13 million. Some of these changes are housekeeping items. But again, could we maybe have just simply done that through a Statutes Amendment Act? Looking through the first part around the Corporations Act, I mean, there was some language back there dating, I believe it was even as much as 40 years. And so, fair enough. Is it really red tape reduction, though? Or is it just what it says it is? It's housekeeping. But, again, if you have to justify $13 million to Albertans, you've got to show them something. So let's show them some housekeeping items maybe that are contained in Bill 22. So as I said, there's some changes within the Corporations Act. It was helpful to at least finally get a bit of a briefing around that from the Associate Minister's staff, which was helpful. There are, of course, some things that maybe are, I guess, require a little bit more attention around no more cabinet approvals for mining or mineral recovery. That's a little bit concerning, and I'm sure my colleague from Edmonton Gold Bar, who's the critic for Environment and Parks, will probably have a lot more details to share in those areas. To simply, I guess, bulldoze ahead, with our heads down, might not necessarily be the best course of action. We're seeing changes around approval of oil sand projects. Very concerning around some of those potential timelines, because we could be, in our effort to try to say, well, we have the quickest approvals anywhere on planet Earth, but we fail in our duty to consult with Indigenous peoples in a meaningful way, in a fulsome way. We've seen many projects that have been delayed because of, well, quite frankly, careless mistakes, like proper consultation. We're seeing land leases being amended, not necessarily a bad thing. Energy efficiency is repealed. You know, we've seen Alberta take a hit on the world stage because we just don't seem to have a credible plan with regard to action on climate change. We've seen downgrades on Alberta's credit rating under this UCP government on that exact issue. And so here we are now starting to eliminate things that we could be doing to try to improve that. Now we start to get into some other things that start to worry me, because anytime I start seeing amendments to Safety Codes Act, hair on the back of my neck starts to stand up. And, you know, I'm seeing legislation around supposedly balancing things around labor laws and whatnot, because we all know that when the Ministry of Red Tape Reduction was established, I clearly made it, and was even told by the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction, that we would not remove protections for Albertans, protections for our environment, all under the guise of red tape reduction. And so I think when we have a piece of legislation of this size, the government can't seem to get around to at least providing a quick technical briefing for a piece of omnibus legislation that at one time they were not in favor of, but now seem to be wholeheartedly in favor of, based on the number of pieces that we've seen come by. If we want to provide that security, that acceptance from Albertans, then I think to come across in an honest and open way, we will achieve results a lot faster. we won't be getting tags hung around our necks as the most secretive government in Canada. We have to do better. It's not going to allow for investment to come in with these kinds of situations. I mean, it's all fine and dandy to sit here and say, well, look how much red tape we've reduced, and it doesn't amount to anything. Again, I mean, here we are with another piece of red tape legislation, and you know, I think about the small brewers here in Alberta who could be doing a lot more business across Canada, but there's all kinds of red tape preventing them from accessing those markets. But funny enough, all of them have access to Alberta. And so instead of maybe reducing red tape for everybody else's business owners, how about we start working to reduce some red tape to help our business owners here in the province expand their businesses? It's just like when we were looking at that legislation around being able to drink in parks. That's great. Doesn't help that we're selling the parks, but kind of reduces the number of places to go and partake. But I bet you there would be more business in the rest of Canada if we had access to it, which would create more jobs here in Alberta for Albertans, because that's what this government promised. We're going to reduce red tape so that business owners can create jobs. Hopefully we'll start to see that happen. I mean, we're already 50,000 jobs pre-pandemic down. The big corporate tax break was supposed to create jobs. It didn't. We've doubled down now. Certainly hope that doesn't mean we're going to lose another 50,000 jobs on top of that or more, because we keep seeing pieces of legislation that are eroding workers' rights. It's going to put them at a disadvantage, and they won't have the money to spend in our own economies. You know, that is supposed to be improving Albertans' lives. I don't see how. Plenty of people saying, well, let's reduce some, you know, why is it affecting, you know, red tape is taking away my holiday pay? Why is red tape reduction taking away my overtime pay? Why is red tape reduction going to prevent my union from effectively advocating on my behalf? Because they're mandated to do that. Unions can get in a lot of trouble when they don't work for their members. Those are the types of red tape reduction that are not helping Albertans, especially through this pandemic. So, I mean, it's great that we're reducing outdated legislation within the Corporations Act, but how many jobs has that created? At this point, I would have to argue it only created one, the Associate Minister of Red Tape, his job. But that doesn't help my constituents who currently find themselves being bogged down with more debt because they're getting charged interest on their utilities. They're not able to pay their mortgages because we may now potentially start finding ourselves with major projects that could be getting built here in the province, getting held up because, well, we reduce red tape to speed it up, and in our rush to get the approval, it gets bogged down in the courts again. So I do look forward to more of the discussion as this goes forward. I'm pretty sure there'll be some amendments coming forward that I think will help to strengthen, Bill 22, and as I said, make it less bad. But I can tell you right now that currently, as it's written, without any amendments being proposed, I'm going to have a very, very hard time supporting it.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I see the Honourable Minister of Transportation has risen on debate.
I'd respond briefly to some of what I heard. Let me assure the honourable member over there that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction is very active in helping to make Alberta a more efficient place for job creators to succeed here and, as a result, create more jobs. I think the honourable member suggested that the other ministries could do this stuff without the Minister of Red Tape Reduction, and I suppose on some level that might be right, except it wouldn't be nearly as effective. In my ministry, for example, we work with the Minister of Red Tape Reduction, and we're working together to get to the goal of reducing 1/3 of all of our regulations, and without that constant working relationship, without that constant being held to account, I don't believe we would get nearly as far. And I don't let other ministers speak for themselves, but I would respectfully like to let the honourable member know that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction is making a big difference for our government, but more importantly for the people of Alberta. And, the honourable member made mention of getting approvals faster. Well, boy, I think he made that kind of sound like an inconsequential thing. But the fact is, in today's world, when an investor is looking for a place to invest money and to create jobs and to create tax revenue should they make money, it's very seldom, probably almost never, that the only place they're looking is Alberta. They're looking at Alberta, other provinces, states in the U.S., other continents. And frankly, what has to do with if somebody wants to invest money, whether it's a large amount or a small amount, not having to wait can make the decision whether they invest here or somewhere else. So I'd just like to share with the honourable member that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction is helping that happen. We're creating that business-friendly atmosphere that will create jobs. And I keep hearing subtext from the other side about it seems like they're offended, Mr. Speaker, that there's profitable corporations. I always hear them talking down and poorly about profitable corporations, and why would you want to help them? Well, Mr. Speaker, unprofitable corporations go out of business, and the jobs that they provide go away with them when they go out of business. And when unprofitable businesses aren't profitable, then many times they can't afford to invest in real estate and technology, and essentially at the end of the day in jobs. So unlike the other side, we're kind of fans of profitable corporations. In fact, we kind of want Alberta to be a place where unprofitable corporations can become profitable, and where profitable corporations can become more profitable. And I know the other side's offended when sometimes the shareholders who actually own the companies get paid, but it's kind of like it's not that much different than if you buy a home and you sell it for more than you bought it for. You're happy about that, and the shareholders of a corporation that buy the property of that corporation are happy. And you know what often happens then is they keep that corporation running, and they keep employing Albertans. And sometimes if they're successful and profitable, they sell more of whatever it is they're making, selling, doing, producing, whether it's legal work, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's agriculture, whether it's meals at a restaurant, whatever it happens to be. And you know what happens when they sell more meals at the restaurant and they sell more oil and gas and they provide more legal services? They need more lawyers. They need more cooks. They need more cleaners. They need more accountants. They need more laborers. They need more professionals. And when they need that, you know what, then they have to hire somebody. And an Albertan family gets to look after themselves, and an Alberta worker gets to look after themselves and their family and send their kids to school. I can't believe, see, the NDP's heckling me because I'm talking in support of Alberta families, people being self-reliant. See, again, the honourable member can't help herself, Mr. Speaker. The thought of Albertans getting a job and being successful and supporting themselves and their family makes the NDP crazy. But but on this side of the house, Mr. Speaker, where we're actually replacing the old child care system with a better one, and our minister has explained that in this House many times. But the honourable member can't actually stand hearing about our policies being designed to make it possible for Albertans to get jobs in Alberta, to look after themselves, to look after their families, to pay their mortgage, and to spend money in the grocery store, the gas station, the flower store, wherever it is, and create more jobs for more Albertans. Somehow, the NDP despises that. They despise companies making money, which is the thing that allows them to hire Albertans, to support themselves, to spend more money, to create more jobs for more Albertans. You see how that works? Well, I think everybody listening at home understands how that works. Our side of the House understands how that works. And the NDP member is so angry about the idea of creating opportunities and self-reliance, and she still can't stop, Mr. Speaker. It's unbelievable how angry the NDP is about Albertans having jobs and being able to support themselves. And I'm as happy to stand here as long as I need to. Well, the angry NDP can't stand the idea of our policies getting out of the way of creating jobs for Albertans.
Amazing.
They just can't. It's no wonder Albertans fired them. They actually despise the idea of Albertans being self-reliant. They despise the idea of corporations or any other companies providing jobs for Albertans. They despise the idea of Albertans saying, I've got a good idea. I'll start a business. I'll create a corporation. I'll hire other Albertans and pay taxes, which support schools and hospitals and children's services and roads and all the things that Albertans care about. And this policy is working great. Thank you very much. This policy is designed to do that. Now, the NDP during their time, Mr. Speaker, killed more jobs than almost humanly possible. Starting with their first bill they passed, which is the carbon tax, which made everything more expensive, but that by most expert opinions took away in the neighborhood minimum 20 to 26,000 jobs right away, and probably many of those jobs from Albertans that depended upon those to look after themselves, to look after their families. So, Mr. Speaker, this is fantastic.
I hesitate to interrupt the honourable presentation, and I, as everybody else, enjoy a good heckle every once in a while. However, the honourable member for Edmonton-Whitemud, I would ask that you perhaps keep some of those comments to yourself, especially as, again, they ride the line with regards to comments that could very easily be called out of order for causing disorder. So if the honourable member does have comments to make, perhaps she could obviously wait for her opportunity to speak after the Minister of Transportation in Committee of the Whole. As we all know, people can even speak more than once. If the Honourable Minister of Transportation could please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that. And, Mr. Speaker, I think that if I'm making the honourable member across the aisle angry, I'm probably saying the right things. I'm probably saying things that are in support of Alberta families and in support of Alberta jobs and in support of profitable Alberta corporations that provide jobs for families and workers and opportunities for people to better their lives and look after their children and to spend money that creates more jobs for more Alberta. And I know that actually angers the NDP, as they've made very, very clear while I've been speaking tonight. But I have to say, we're not angry about that. We're happy about that. This is what we came here to do, to create opportunities for jobs in Albertans. And Mr. Speaker, one of the big jobs of government is really to get out of the way of business to provide those opportunities. And that's part of what this red tape reduction plan is about, and this red tape reduction bill and the red tape reduction minister is about creating those circumstances where when someone wants to create jobs for Alberta workers and Alberta families, and they're deciding between Alberta and another jurisdiction, that it's going to be easier for them to choose Alberta. To choose Alberta to be a place to provide jobs and opportunities, mortgage-paying jobs for people. Mr. Speaker, we have a lot more work to do, but I have to tell you, I believe we're on the right track. I believe Albertans sent us here to do this. Albertans rejected the anti-business, anti-worker-friendly attitude of the NDP that drove north of $35 billion out of this province. To other places, other jurisdictions in Europe and Asia and the United States and even other provinces, because the NDP made it clear they were not business friendly, Mr. Speaker. You can't actually be against business and say you're for workers, because where workers work, they work at jobs, which are businesses. But the NDP hasn't quite connected those dots. They claim to be for workers, but they're against the places where workers work. I know. It doesn't make sense to me either, Mr. Speaker. I know, I can see how much you agree with this, though I will make, for the record, make it clear you haven't said anything. So, Mr. Speaker, but the folks on the other side, and particularly the angry ones that were trying to talk over me when I've got the floor, do not accept the fact that cutting red tape is one of the many, many things we need to do, and our work's not near done yet. We have to dig out of the COVID situation that we're in. We got to dig out of what was a negative and single-digit energy prices that we are in. But I can tell you what, we are working hard to put this province on a path where we can dig out of that and create more jobs and more opportunities for more Albertans, and so that their children, when they grow up, can stay in Alberta and have a good paying, mortgage paying job and raise their family here instead of having to leave in droves, as many did when the NDP were in government. Mr. Speaker, that's what red tape reduction is about. It's a piece of the puzzle that matters. It's a piece of the puzzle that is designed to create jobs and opportunities for Albertans to stay here and create and make money and spend that money and create more jobs and more opportunities for more Albertans. And that's the kind of momentum we're trying to create, which is exactly the opposite of the negative momentum we had through 4 long years before Albertans fired the NDP for not doing exactly that.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Our Minister, are there any Honourable Members looking to join debate on this matter? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton South has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to rise tonight and speak to Bill 22, the Red Tape Reduction and Implementation Act 2020. And Mr. Chair, oh geez, I mean, it's a 170-something page bill that addresses so many different ministries, addresses so many different pieces of legislation, and makes sweeping changes. I mean, some of them it appears to be relatively inconsequential, but some of them are indeed quite consequential. And I think it's important that we actually address the legislation, and we actually address the issues in the legislation. We actually address things like fundamental changing to environmental monitoring, fundamental changes to things like municipal reporting and municipal responsibility, and things in this bill, things like how it's repealing energy efficiency, changes to the Vital Statistics Act, or changes to the Safety Code Amendment Act, changes to the Surface Rights Act. There's just so many actual different issues in this bill. And Mr. Chair, that's okay. I mean, certainly I'm opposed to omnibus legislation. I think that certainly we should break out legislation so that this place has an adequate opportunity to discuss each of those issues. And indeed, for example, in the Vital Statistics Act, we are debating that in this House at a different bill right now. And I guess the question is really, why did the government choose to have this brought forward in 2 separate bills? And it's interesting because in the press release and in the press statements that were made around the release of this bill, of Bill Bill 22, the Red Tape Reduction Implementation Act, the Minister of Red Tape was the one that was introducing this bill, and he provided the briefing to the media and of course Albertans, and many questions were asked around many of these important pieces of legislation, things like environmental monitoring, things like energy efficiency, things like safety code amendments or Surface Rights Act, and all of these are real issues for Albertans. And as the Minister of Transportation rose in this place and said that these are all pieces of different parts of the puzzle. They're all pieces of different parts of the puzzle that address things like how are we going to try and get Albertans back to work. In my opinion, and I think in Albertans' opinion, this government is actually failing at that. Before the COVID pandemic, this government has actually already lost 50,000 jobs, over 50,000 jobs before the pandemic had even started. But now we know that this is a piece of the puzzle that the government wants to use to try and pull themselves out of that hole, pull themselves out of the economic disaster they've created, pull themselves out of the situation where Albertans are not able to work and do not have the supports that they need. And this is a piece of the puzzle that the Minister of Transport has risen in this place and said is so essential, and this Minister of Red Tape Reduction is doing so much great work that he wouldn't be able to do it without the support of the Minister of Red Tape Reduction. And that's the Minister of Transportation's words in this place. Now, Mr. Chair, the very pressing concern I have around that then, the very pressing concern I would have is that it appears the Minister of Red Tape Reduction has nothing more than, actually even lacks a cursory knowledge of the individual components of this bill. When this bill was brought up in the media briefing and to the public, a number of questions were asked by technical questions were asked by members of the media, and indeed in this place we have seen a number of technical questions asked by my colleagues as well, whether in question period or tonight or at other points that this bill was debated. Technical questions were asked to the Minister of Red Tape Reduction regarding things like what is the justification around changes to the Emergency Management Act, including why are we changing some of these things in statutes or when it can be done. Why are we changing some of these pieces here instead of in the Statutes Amendments Act, or when we're looking at the Emissions Management and Climate Resilience Act? Why are we looking at some of these changes? And it turns out that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction is unable to answer even a single one of those questions, whether it is here in this House or out in the media with the public. So it becomes abundantly clear that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction does not appear to actually understand the individual components, the individual clauses, and the individual acts in the bill. And I mean, I'm pretty sure that's something that Albertans will be disappointed about. I think it's something that Albertans will be disappointed because they will struggle to understand why we are bringing in this omnibus piece over 170, I believe it's 175 pages of legislation under this minister who has tens of millions of dollars in his portfolio. Albertans will struggle to understand, in the Minister of Transportation's words, if his role is so essential in helping to understand these individual components, why can the minister not explain any of them? Why is the minister unable to actually stand in this place and speak to the Marketing of Agricultural Products Act? Because that is one of the bills that has changed by this legislation. Why is the minister unable to stand in this place and explain any of these actual changes? Because it becomes clear that each of these individual ministers are the only ones that know what is happening in this bill. The Minister of Agriculture is the only person who understands what is happening for the Agricultural Products Act on the government bench. The Minister of Energy is the only person who understands the Mines and Minerals Act being changed in this bill, and it becomes abundantly clear that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction, even though other members of the front bench have said he is so important and his role is so important, it becomes abundantly clear that he is actually not being consulted and not actually being involved in any of the individual changes to reduce the red tape. So the question then becomes, what is the role of the Minister of Red Tape Reduction? Because the Minister of Red Tape Reduction gets up in this place and says he is driving forward these changes. He is solely responsible for ensuring all ministries do this work. He's solely responsible for making sure that this type of work moves forward, and it's going to be so important for making sure we have more jobs for Albertans. It's going to be so important to make sure we recover the economy. It's going to be so important to make sure that they pull themselves out of the 50,000 jobs that this government lost before the COVID pandemic. It's so important that we do this, that the minister cannot explain a single clause of his own bill. The minister cannot explain a single item in his own bill with regard to issues such as the Municipal Government Act, because when asked, the minister simply says, oh, please refer to the Minister of Municipal Affairs. When asked about the Oil Sands Conservation Act, the minister says, please refer to the AER or the Minister of Energy. And it becomes clear that it does not seem to be the case that this legislation is necessary. It does not seem to be the case that this type of omnibus legislation is necessary. It does not seem to be the case that the Cabinet needs this additional body spending tens of millions of dollars of Albertans' money to simply say, well, I've introduced a bill that was the sum work of all of my colleagues. It appears the Minister of Red Tape Reduction has not done any of that work himself, has not done the homework to understand any of the work, has not actually bothered to read any of that information, and instead has deferred all of the work in this bill, all of the information that is encompassed in 175 pages in this legislation, which is again a very lengthy bill and quite unusual in terms of an omnibus piece of legislation that it touches so much, because when you include things like vital statistics, to Safety Codes Amendment, to Recreation Development Acts, you're touching a lot of different pieces of information, and that can be very complicated. And Mr. Speaker, that is the very reason that, Mr. Chair, that is the very reason that in this place we do indeed have actual different ministries, that there are ministers of things like transportation, ministers of finance, ministers of economic development and trade, ministers of labor, ministers of environment. We have all these different types of ministries because they have subject matter expertise. They are able to understand and recognize in their portfolios where there may be an opportunity to do reductions in duplication, where there may be opportunities to increase efficiencies and do those types of changes. And of course, we commend the government when they are trying to do those types of things. We may disagree on the extent of which they should be doing it. We may disagree on what we consider duplication or consider red tape in this case. But what I think is becoming abundantly clear is that the Ministry of Red Tape Reduction's goal, the stated goal of that ministry, is not being accomplished, is not actually being achieved because of that ministry. It becomes abundantly clear that it is every other minister pulling the weight. So the question again is, does that justify the creation of both this bill and that ministry and that minister's portfolio? And it appears that Albertans are not getting a good value for money. Indeed, it actually appears that if the Minister of Transportation is correct, that his ministry is able to make some of these changes himself, and if the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Labor were able to make those types of changes themselves, and were able to bring the subject matter expertise, that when the Minister of Red Tape is asked about any of the changes, for example, in this bill of things like what are the technicalities around repealing Energy Efficiency Alberta, if those technical details and the repeal of that technical is entirely encompassed by the Minister of Environment's portfolio and Minister of Environment staff and the Minister of Environment's expertise, then what actual added value did the Minister of Red Tape Reduction bring to the table? It turns out nothing. It turns out that it appears that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction is a layer of added bureaucracy and added red tape to create nothing other than extra paperwork and bring in this omnibus piece of legislation. All of these individual changes could have been brought forward by their subject matter experts, which are the individual ministers on that front bench. The ministers who are being paid and have files that exist to make sure that they are able to understand the complications and would have been able to explain to Albertans, explain to this House, explain to the media why things like the Recreation Development Act is being repealed, or why the Safety Codes Amendment Act is being changed around administrative penalties. All of those types of questions, and all the types of questions around things like why the Surface Rights Act is amended by the board's ability to hear cases with claim values, all those types up to 50,000 instead of 25,000, all those types of questions that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction stands in this place and continues to defer and continues to say, please ask the relevant minister, please ask the relevant minister. We do not have the answers. The government does not have the answers. It is only the relevant minister that does. It becomes abundantly clear that basically what the Minister of Red Tape Reduction is doing is acting as a switchboard. Is acting as a switchboard and saying, please go to this other minister, please go to this other minister, please go to this other portfolio. And it becomes abundantly clear that, Mr. Chair, that is basically the definition of red tape. We're duplicating the efforts of certain ministries in the government. And in this case, we appear to be duplicating the efforts of almost every ministry in the government. So it's fairly clear to me, Mr. Speaker, that there is no need for the Ministry of Red Tape Reduction, that this bill, while it touches on so many things, and while in some cases it may have credible reductions in duplication of work and may have credible efficiency finding. In many cases, they can be amended through other pieces of legislation that are already before this House, such as the Statutes Amendment Act, such as the Vital Statistics Act amendment that we're going through, such as other pieces of legislation, ministers who would actually be able to answer those technical questions about what have been able to bring forward themselves. It becomes abundantly clear that this piece of legislation seems to be a make-work project. It seems to be a project that is designed to create busy work for the Ministry of Red Tape Reduction. It's designed to bring in this additional layer of bureaucracy. It's designed to bring in this additional layer of red tape. It's designed to bring in essentially an excuse to justify the minister's existence. And I think that's very concerning. I think it's concerning for a government that touts their fiscal credibility and touts their fiscal acuity, Mr. Chair. I think it's pretty concerning that they would go out of their way to try and create a very expensive ministry to create additional bureaucracy, create additional jobs for friends and donors, and hold up the work of the government. Because that is essentially what the Minister of Red Tape Reduction is doing. The Minister of Red Tape Reduction is saying, well, before you can go in and find all those efficiencies yourself and do that, you have to come to our ministry first. That's what the Minister of Transport has said, is basically that he has to coordinate with the Minister of Red Tape Reduction and all of his efficiency findings. So basically what we're saying is we're delaying this process. We're making it less efficient. We're making government less efficient. And indeed, government shouldn't have to be at the whim of the Ministry of Red Tape Reduction when they want to make these types of changes. They shouldn't have to. Wait for the Ministry of Red Tape Reduction to actually go and read his notes, and it's so abundantly clear that the Associate Minister did not even understand what was in the bill when it was introduced, and likely still does not understand what is in the bill. That we should have been seeing this come forward from those individual ministries. We should have been seeing the reasonable changes hidden in this 175-page omnibus bill. There are reasonable changes. There are changes that expire, that repeal expired pieces of legislation that, for example, have not applied since the 80s. There's changes that do things such as removing cabinet approval for certain actions that basically never happened. There's some changes in here that are actually good changes. But, Mr. Chair, the concerning thing is that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction, the minister sponsoring this bill, who is receiving tens of millions of dollars to do this, cannot explain any of those changes, cannot actually speak to any of those changes, cannot actually understand what is happening in these changes. And I mean, that's pretty disappointing. It's pretty disappointing that Albertans are going to have to pay extra to get less. Because we could have got all these changes without the Minister of Red Tape Reduction. We would have likely got all these changes without the Minister of Red Tape Reduction. Indeed, we are actually looking at, in this place, the Miscellaneous Statutes Amendment Act, which many of these changes could have fallen under, right? We're talking about things like repealing expired legislation that no longer has an application. That is something that is basically, by definition, should be falling into Miscellaneous Statutes Amendments Act, right? So Mr. Chair, it's clear to me, and I think it's clear to Albertans, that the minister is looking for a role, that the government is looking for an excuse to continue to have the Minister of Red Tape Reduction. And we know the Ministry of Red Tape Reduction was this key plank in the government's platform, right? And it was this key idea that the government wanted to bring forward. And Mr. Speaker, I suspect perhaps the Premier and the government are a little bit disappointed that they found out that there was actually no role for this ministry, that there was actually no need for this ministry, but having allocated tens of millions of dollars to it, and having allocated a minister to it, and having allocated all these resources to it, they had to come up with something. They had to come up with a bill that they could introduce and say we're doing all these amazing things. But Mr. Chair, Albertans will see through that. Albertans will understand that basically they are not getting the value for money. And for the finance minister to sit in this place and stand in this place and say that they are he is using his fiscal acuity to manage the government's finances and navigate through this difficult economic time, and then go and waste money on the Minister of Red Tape Reduction and allow the Minister of Red Tape Reduction to basically waste tens of millions of Alberta taxpayer dollars so that there can be a busy work project for a platform plank, I think that is basically the definition of irresponsible. Right? I think it's irresponsible of the Minister of Finance not to go into Cabinet and say, we do not need this ministry. We can make these changes without this ministry. And I know the Minister of Transport said, well, the Minister of Red Tape Direction is pushing forward so hard with these changes for us, is making sure we coordinate this. Is that not also the definition of what is in the Minister of Finance's job? Does the Minister of Finance's job not include, and the President of Treasury Board's job not include, trying to oversee government finances and making sure there isn't inefficiency? Does the President of Treasury Board no longer oversee and make sure that there is approval of all of the spending of these funds and that there is fiduciary responsibility being carried out? Is that no longer the Minister of Finance's job, or does he simply justify to himself that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction can do this on top of and duplicate that effort to double check his work? Does the Minister of Finance either not trust his own work, or does he agree that he needs to create this additional bureaucracy, create this additional red tape, and delay the process and cost Alberta taxpayers more? That's basically the question that Albertans want answered. It's basically the question that the opposition here wants answered, and we want to understand why it is that the government, which prides itself on trying to reduce red tape, and in so much as they created a ministry for it, does not even have the insight to be able to understand that this is by itself, by nature, a duplication of effort, and by nature, a duplication of processes, and by definition, a creation of additional red tape. Because we know this omnibus bill, again, Mr. Chair, which is extremely unusual, right? It is extremely unusual for an omnibus bill like this to address so many different pieces of legislation, unless it's a Miscellaneous Statutes Amendment Act, which we have before this House, and many of these pieces of legislation could have gone under. So it becomes pretty clear, Mr. Chair, it becomes pretty clear that perhaps the Minister of Red Tape Reduction has been tasked to deal with some of these miscellaneous statutes, but they didn't want to put it in that bill, Mr. Chair, because they needed to find work, as it were, for the minister, and they needed to justify the budget of the ministry. They needed to justify why the minister existed. And indeed, I think if that was indeed the government's goal, and I would not wish to speak for the government, but if indeed the government's goal was to justify spending millions of Albertans' dollars on red tape reduction and in duplication of that effort and creating additional bureaucracy between the ministries, if that was indeed the government's goal, I wish perhaps they would have given the minister actual briefing notes on what he was introducing. I wish they would have given the minister an actual technical briefing on the individual clauses he was introducing, on the individual bills he was touching on, and perhaps the minister would have been able to rise in the place, and perhaps he still will be in the future able to rise in this place and explain why his legislation is required, explain the individual bills he is touching on. Perhaps he could hopefully explain to Albertans what types of changes are coming to energy efficiency Alberta. Because Mr. Chair, I've read many parts of this bill. I've read the bill, and unfortunately, it appears that the minister has not. Right? It appears that the minister, when asked in this place, when asked in the public by the media, it appears that again and again the minister decides to defer to other ministries. Right? He decides to act as that switchboard, to redirect, to say only the subject matter experts will have this information. And indeed, if that is the case, and if that is the truth, then the question again becomes, what is the point? What is the point of this legislation? What is the point of this minister? What is the point of this ministry? It is simply a waste of money. It is simply a waste of Alberta taxpayer dollars. It is simply a waste of this Assembly's efforts because we are not able to get the actual answers from the sponsoring minister. We are not able to actually get the answers from the sponsoring minister, and indeed we rely on the government's ability to have other ministers answer on his behalf. It becomes abundantly clear that this minister either is not doing his job or simply is not reading the briefings or is not being provided the briefings. Whatever it is, Mr. Chair, whatever the case may be, it's disappointing. It's disappointing because Albertans expected value for money. I believe when they voted for this government, they expected a government that would have would be financially responsible, and instead they have a minister who basically is running around as a paper boy, an errand boy for some of the other portfolios, and I think that's pretty disappointing. But I look forward to hearing out the debate.
As you all know, we had the opportunity to speak many times at committee, and I would just recommend that the honourable member try to focus his comments directly to the bill in debate and perhaps not the minister or the ministry. I see the Honourable Minister of Finance has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That is a difficult act to follow, what we've just heard there. But it's interesting, Mr. Chair, even your comments, because from what I could make out from the member opposite, in fact, from what I can make out from the comments to date around this bill, this red tape reduction bill, Bill 22, I've not heard concern about the substance of the bill, Mr. Chair. In fact, there's not been one item where there has been a rational, logical suggestion for change or legitimate concern with the substance of the bill. It seems, Mr. Chair, that the members opposite are offended that our Premier actually appointed an Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction to focus on reducing red tape for Albertans and Alberta businesses. Red tape, Mr. Chair, that the members opposite, when they were in government, added layers and layers and layers to, which impeded Alberta businesses. It impeded Alberta nonprofits. It added cost and time to Alberta families. So Mr. Chair, it seems again that the members opposite are offended that we have an Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction dedicated to the very important task of reducing red tape on behalf of Albertans and Alberta businesses. And Mr. Chair, the work that our Associate Minister does is incredibly valuable. Not only valuable to this government and to the individual ministries, but it's incredibly valuable work on behalf of Albertans. Hear, hear. Because we have an Associate Minister who works with the other ministries identifying red tape that needs to be removed, regulations that need to be modernized, regulations that are redundant, regulations that add cost and burden to Alberta job creators, to Alberta nonprofits, to every aspect of our society here in the province. So, Mr. Chair, I just need to rise this evening and reaffirm our Premier's decision to appoint our Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction, who is doing an excellent job working across government and across ministries at modernizing our regulatory environment in this province, and identifying red tape that needs to be removed, and assisting every ministry in moving the meter, which will make life better for Albertans, which will make life better for Alberta businesses, which will lead to increased investment and increased job creation, something the members opposite have no idea about, Mr. Chair. And with that, I adjourn debate.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. Having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable Minister of Finance to adjourn debate and report progress on Bill 22, Red Tape Reduction Implementation Act 2020, when the committee rises, are you agreed? Agreed. Any opposed? That is carried. 25. The Committee of the Whole now has under consideration Bill number 25, Protecting Alberta Industry from Theft Act 2020. Are there any comments, questions, 1 second, or amendments on this matter? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Beverly Clairview has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll keep my comments fairly brief. It's interesting that the government is bringing forward this bill, and I mean, interesting maybe is not the right word. This bill, the theme of this bill, has been brought forward a number of times through this House. In fact, I recall when it was brought forward, I believe it was around 2012, an iteration of this bill did come through when I was a new member at the time, Mr. Chair, and it came through a private member's bill. But if I recall, and this is going to take some significant recollection to come back to a bill in 2012, but I do recall that there were some concerns with the bill as it was written then. And I'll start off by saying that the spirit and the intention of the bill, I don't know if there's anybody in this place that will not recognize the value of wanting to ensure that we are protecting especially our folks, industry, businesses, private households in rural Alberta, because we know that there is a market for scrap metal. And I recall hearing story after story about businesses that had been raided or looted, with thieves going after the scrap metal and then selling it. And so the issue really was how do we protect those individuals, again, whether they are businesses or families in communities, especially in rural Alberta. I mean, we've talked many times in this place about protecting rural Albertans and how just because of where they live, it's a challenge if they are being robbed and if they are present when it's happening, of getting a quick response from the RC or from others to be able to provide assistance. So we know that it's a serious risk for individuals. We know that this will send a strong message, especially for thieves that are trying to take advantage of especially vulnerable Albertans. And so, really for that matter, or for that reason, that it's significant that we do support this bill, that I will be voting in favor of this bill. And we just saw, in fact, there was, I believe, a couple of weeks ago, there was the police made an arrest on a ring of catalytic converters that was sizable in this province. And so, I think if there's a way to protect Albertans, then we're definitely in favor of it. And with this bill, if I'm understanding it correctly, that it will ensure that that scrap metal transactions are documented. And so this really does safeguard individuals and ensure that scrap metal dealers or those that accept it have the proper provisions and parameters in place. I mean, not that they would intentionally accept materials that they may know were taken unlawfully, but I mean, this is again to protect everyone from that. So with that, Mr. Chair, I will take my seat. I just wanted to comment briefly on this bill and that I will be supporting it.
Thank you. Are there any honourable members looking to join debate? I see the honourable member for Calgary West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know we're getting late here. I'll just be very brief, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for his comments in regards to this bill. I can tell you regarding the importance of having accountability in that particular industry and having that necessary documentation, even as far back as when I was a young constable in the Calgary Police Service. I can tell you that copper theft and metals of value have been an issue, and it probably predated, for sure, even predated me when I was a young constable back in the day. But that being said, it is great to see a piece of legislation that is on the floor. I certainly support it, and I certainly encourage all members of this House to support that. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I ask that we rise and. Oh, sorry, my apologies, sir. I ask that I sit down. Thank you.
Thank you, honourable member. Are there any honourable members looking to join debate at this time?
Question.
Are you ready for the question on Bill 25, Protecting Alberta Industry from Theft Act 2020? On the clauses of the bill, are you agreed?
Agreed.
Any opposed? Carried. On the title and preamble, are you agreed?
Agreed.
Any opposed? Carried. Shall the bill be reported? Are you agreed? Agreed. Any opposed? Carried. And then we need a government house leader. I see the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader and Minister of Transportation has risen.
Thank you, Chair. At this point, I move the committee rise and report Bill 25 and rise and report progress on Bill 22.
Having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader, are you agreed?
Agreed.
Any opposed? That is carried. I see the honourable member for Athabasca Barhead Westlock has risen.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole has had under consideration certain bills. The committee reports the following bill, Bill 25. The committee reports progress on the following bill, Bill 22.
Member, does the Assembly concur in the report? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried. I see the Honourable Minister of Transportation has risen.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for recognizing me. I want to thank members from both sides of the House for their contributions and debates this evening, and the progress that we made. It's after 11 o'clock. We've had a fairly full day, and at this point, Mr. Speaker, I move that the Assembly adjourn until 9 a.m. Wednesday, July 8th.
Thank you, Honourable Minister of Transportation. I will say it is sometimes difficult to recognize you without your mustache. Having seen what you have said there, those members in favour of the motion as moved by the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader and Minister of Transportation, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried. The Assembly stands adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.